everyone, good evening, and welcome to another episode of Retro Night, the stream where I'm going to be doing classic retro games, classic retro watch parties, and more. We have a watch party tonight. So good to see you, Dragon. Good to see you, Ice Pick. Good to see you, Destiny. Hope you're all doing really good tonight. It's Thursday, May 31st. No, May 30th. We're not at 31st yet. May 30th, 2024. And good to see you, Hito. Which ones did I watch? I only watched the State of Play. That's it. The only things that I really cared for from the State of Play were Astrobot, Monster Hunter Wilds, Silent Hill 2 remake, and God of War coming to PC, even though I did see the news that the God of War PC port requires PSN, but at the same time, like, really the best thing to come from PlayStation mostly were Monster Hunter Wilds and Astrobot. Astrobot looks amazing. But hopefully everybody in chat is doing very well tonight. So the current lineup tonight, we're going to be watching G4TV's Icons. So Icons is a show that was on G4 where they showcased the history of video game like companies, certain themes, like for example arcades or consoles and all that stuff, like Sega Dreamcast or like the NES, and like key figures in the gaming industry like Shigeru Miyamoto, and many more. So this show has been ongoing for years, up until 2006, like for 4 years of its life cycle. But it was reran and it's all over YouTube as well. And then the lineup that we're going to be watching tonight, depending on the timing, we might not have time for everything here, but I hope we have time for most of the stuff that I have planned tonight. So we're going to watch Tetris, Pac-Man, Mega Man, Shigeru Miyamoto, Yuji Naka, Doom, Dreamcast, arcade games, fighting games, Mortal Kombat, Game Boy, Metal Gear Solid, History of E3, and The Legend of Zelda. There's probably going to be some people wondering exactly just why I didn't pick certain games or certain other themes, but I just figured I'd pick what I felt like watching, and then we'll just see what happens. Yay, good to see you, Maverick. The 5 stream streak. Yes, let's go. Let's see. So as far as everything else goes, we do have a schedule still for the rest of the week. Because Sunday we're gonna go back to Paper Mario at the Thousand Year Door, and then we got Share with Shell Shock Cartoon Network Stories Part 2. But yeah, so we definitely have a lot planned tonight. We're gonna be watching Icons. We're gonna watch a couple of episodes of Icons. What I'm gonna do is so because this is a watch party, we're gonna be watching episodes of Icons. I am going to mute all the alerts for this. And we're going to be watching each and every episode that I have planned tonight. Got any snacks? Well, the only thing I have is ice cream, but I'm actually saving. I already had some earlier, but I'm saving it for like another day. Which the ice cream is basically like those popsicles. The specific one that I got was the creamsicles, the orange coating with the vanilla cream, like the creamsicles. Those are my favorites. But I'm saving those. Yes, ice cream is really good right now. But that being said, which one we're gonna get started with? Because there's no particular order from that lineup, so I can pick whichever one. I will say though, I want to at least save the Mega Man one for the second hour, like in the 9 o'clock hour. I want to save it for then, for that particular point. And I'm saving The Legend of Zelda for last. The Legend of Zelda one is going to be the last one we're doing. But what we're starting first, well, we're going to start with arcade. So let me go ahead and switch to the scene. We're going to start with arcade.
We grew up in them.
Space Invaders, that was great. The games I really loved were Asteroids, Missile Command,
Yep.
and above all, Defender.
Defender was interesting.
But I loved Robotron. I thought that was a really good.
Oh, I remember
fantastic game.
Robotron.
And they made a fortune, 25 cents at a time.
We're talking about in 1981, Americans dropped 20 billion quarters into arcade machines.
They were the gaming world.
It was really weird because it wasn't like a kid phenomenon. It was like really across the board phenomenon.
Well, they popped up everywhere.
But all good things
How
come
about
to
now?
an end.
It was a fad. I think there's no other way to put it until finally, the whole thing.
Remember,
sort of
this was the
collapsed under its own
2000s
weight.
when
This is the
these
story
episodes were
of the
made.
birth and fall of the arcade industry.
All right. We've had different eras of arcades over the years, but they all start somewhere. Oh, we'll see more of Miss Pac-Man when we get to the Pac-Man episode later on.
Starting as far back as the late 1800s, penny arcade machines such as strength testers and peep shows dot local pubs and fairgrounds.
Yep.
In
That is true.
1927, David Gottlieb creates Baffle Ball, the precursor to the modern pinball machine. His simple
Yep.
game sparks the pinball craze. Soon, the mini arcades that grew out of the Great Depression are packed with pinball
They're
machines.
exactly what you think.
For decades, pinball rules the arcades. But in 1971, a man named Nolan Bushnell changes everything.
He wasn't much of an engineer, but he had these great
this guy.
ideas for doing businesses. He saw how he could take the technology
Nolan
we were using at
Bushnell's an asshole.
Ampex and make a coin-operated amusement device that might be a hit. He then built this thing called Computer Space. Computer Space was not a great marketing success.
Computer Space was a
Hey, Wolfie, how you
flop.
doing?
They made 1,000 copies of it. They
Yep,
didn't sell
Pong.
all 1,000 copies of it. It wasn't popular. It didn't make
Pong
it to
is
very
not the
many
first arcade
venues,
game.
and where it did make it, it wasn't very popular.
One of the earliest arcade games was actually Tennis for Two.
So he challenged me to do
And that was like in the
ping-pong
late
game,
50s.
a very simple one moving spot.
Early 60s, I think.
Nothing could be simpler.
Al got it to the point where it just had the two paddles, and it was knocking the ball back.
I hope
and
you're doing
forth.
good,
It was so
Wolfie.
much fun. I said, "Stop. We don't need to go to the next step."
In 1972, the first Pong machine is placed in Andy Capp's pub in Sunnyvale, and from there, it becomes the world's first huge video game success. The average Pong machine pulls in $100 a week in quarters.
That might be available.
Oh my God, it's everywhere. Oh, I go, oh God, what have I done?
Soon, Atari isn't the only big company making coin-operated video games. Cinematronics makes a name for itself by releasing a number of successful vector games.
A vector
yeah.
game or a vector display actually just takes a single beam and
Quarters.
the
A
programmer
million
or
allowances for the
hardware
quarters.
directs it to go to this point to this point, and that draws a line.
Among their releases is the world's
Oh,
first
sure, no problem.
cooperative
I'll
game,
check that out
Rip-Off,
soon. But
created by Tim
I'm doing
Skelly
pretty good
in
otherwise right
1980.
now.
Rip-off was something that
no worries.
we'd come up with just in kicking around some names for a game, and I had something that was kind of almost like centipedes in the back of my head. And I just decided that it would be more interesting if instead of shooting at
I
each
know what
other,
you're referencing, Ice Pig. I know
that
exactly what
they
you're
both
referencing.
shot at the enemy. And believe it or not, market
That
research
Futurama episode.
said that cooperation amongst young people had become a major factor. And I thought,
And
well,
Uncle
that's
had a
great.
rip-off.
That fits right into
Uncle
my
had a
plans.
rip-off. Nice.
So we made a
Yo,
cooperative
like,
game, and it became just a
The
huge
Atari
success
era
and a great
was
deal of fun to play.
basically, like,
But the
way
true
before my
arrival of the
time.
arcade is brought about by three key games.
It was basically my older brother's era, if anything. But I don't really know just how much he was into it.
The first of these is Space Invaders, which is released in 1978.
Space Invaders actually
things I
had
do like about the
gameplay
show,
that was
some things that
interesting
really
and actually
dislike.
had a scoring
Yeah.
modality, so a person could get a score, and you could compete with someone else and compare your scores, and therefore a person could become, quote,
this
a
guy,
video
Walter
game
Day
champion.
from Twin Galaxies.
So Space Invaders was like the first game in this 3-game progression.
With Asteroids following close behind.
Asteroids, it was me
understanding
for
about
project
video
leader.
games, but I was
There was
supposed to
only
be
one
more fun.
programmer. There was a technician, the electrical engineer.
It's more for
I
entertainment
did
than actually
the
educating
art,
people on games.
just line drawings, basically, all the fonts and stuff.
I haven't watched G4 in a long time.
That was basically
but
an
this
entire
was,
team.
this was actually my favorite show on G4. This is an Attack of the
Lyle
Show.
Raines called me in his office and said, we had this game called
Attack of the
Cosmos,
Show
I
was
think it
great.
where it was a big rock on the screen. The
Remember
idea was to shoot the other
Cheats?
player. But
Where
the
they-
rock was
where
in
it
the
was
way, and
just all
people
about
kept
cheat
shooting the
codes?
rock. And he said, well, they kept shooting the rock, and nothing happens. Why don't we put rocks on the screen, and the player blows them up? And I said, that sounds like an interesting idea.
Space
Also,
Invaders
we
was
need
actually
something
pretty
to
good.
make the players come out more, so I suggested a saucer that would come out and take a shot at the player if he didn't do anything, or if the number of rocks got real low. I just went out and did it, so within a few weeks I had things floating around the screen.
Yeah.
And Asteroids suddenly had further enhanced
I don't know if he
gameplay
still
where
works
people
for
could get very
Taito.
high scores, and also got the competition going for people playing against each other in a bigger way than Space Invaders started for high score laurels.
Didn't G4 also had Ninja Warrior?
And then
Pac-Man.
Pac-Man is unleashed.
But the final thing that really got it going was the third game in this progression.
Yeah, I do
and that's
remember that
Pac-Man.
aspect.
When Pac-Man came out,
But I also
it caused
remember.
everybody
But I mainly
to fall in
watched
love with
like
video
the
games.
machinima stuff
Men,
that was
women,
on
children,
like internet at
professional
the time.
people, anybody,
Back when Red
any
vs.
walk
Blue
of
was
life,
huge.
any age, became
That much I
enamored with
remember,
video
but
games. And
I haven't
Pac-Man
watched the one that was on
single-handedly
G4.
brought the entire female audience into the arcade. At the same time, because of its uniqueness and because of its incredible
Pac-Man. I
cross-spectrum
spent so
appeal.
much time on
Pac-Man was hit
games.
everywhere it went.
We'll
right
talk
off
more
the
about
bat.
Pac-Man when we get to the
The
Pac-Man
success
episode.
of Pac-Man, Asteroids, and Space Invaders opens the
Donkey
floodgates for
Kong.
the arcade revolution.
Sorgalexian.
And the gaming world will soon become more successful than anyone ever dreamed.
Oh, Mr. Pac-Man is objectively the better game, but Pac-Man obviously was what opened the doors.
By the early 1980s, arcades are everywhere.
Well, they popped up everywhere. You know,
Y'all can spot
7-Elevens
the-
would carry
the
them.
games that you
By
see.
the time we get to the
Obviously
middle
point it out
80s,
if you can.
grocery stores are carrying them.
Miss Pac-Man.
The funny one, of course, is at least one funeral home had a couple of arcade machines in its basement.
Okay, I just want to pause real quick just to say this. Of all the funeral homes I've been to, I have not seen an arcade machine at any of them. It must have been like before my time, but when I was growing up, I have not seen a single one, and I haven't even seen any of them in the grocery stores.
It was an incredible phenomenon at that time. In 1981, Americans dropped 20 billion quarters into arcade machines.
Right, but
They spent 75,000
I don't think a funeral
years
home is like
playing
the best
arcade
place to
games
play
in
video games.
1981.
The
Or the
media
best
takes
time.
notice as arcades become part of popular culture.
But at this point now, we reached a peak where, it was now okay for middle-class people to go into arcades.
The arcade crowd back in the old days was really weird because you definitely had all the little scrubs like me, like little kids who were riding their bikes there, and then you had like high school students and you had college students. It was mostly the guys, but you had the girls kind of hanging there looking at what was going on. But then it was also really weird because you had like businessmen.
You just have to be kids, didn't have to be young, didn't have to be, just a slacker.
It was really weird because it wasn't like a kid phenomenon. It was like really across the board phenomenon in terms of who was playing arcade games. I think the golden age was like in the early to mid 80s, when you had like all the amazing Midway games and the Atari games. Games like
Yeah, Midway.
Joust.
Man, I miss Midway. That was a cool company.
The games I really loved were Asteroids,
Mark Cerny. He works for Sony now.
Man, and above all, Defender.
Defender came out and that was like changed the world.
And thanks to people like Eugene Jarvis, creator of Defender and Robotron, the hits just keep coming.
Yeah, I remember
Eugene is a wild man. Eugene is a poster boy for something in our industry. I'm not sure what.
Oh God!
Defender was cool.
A
because you'd
bonsai
see
arbor.
it, and it was only the older kids could play it because it was so intimidating. There's like 1,000 buttons. I remember like trying to play it a few times and
By the way,
couldn't get anywhere with
Eugene
it.
Jarvis, he
Defender was
owns
the
Raw
ultimate
Thrills.
game for the hardcore gamer. It had 7 buttons. I mean, I don't think any other game had that degree of control complexity. Just trying to keep track of them.
The
would
same
drive
Raw
you
Thrills that
crazy.
helped Nintendo make Cruise
I think my
Blast,
pinky is still kind of crooked from having spent so many
as
hours
well as that
pushing
TMNT
that
arcade
control
game, among
up
many
and down.
others.
I finally learned how to play it. And that was pretty.
Yep.
I would describe that as a life-changing moment.
Because he used to
So
work
we
for
sat
Midway.
there and played it like the whole day, like until my mom dragged us out of there.
No worries,
I
Enigma.
loved Robotron. And I thought that was a really fantastic.
I first played Robotron in one of those
Robotron,
like
which is one of my
arcade
favorite games. I actually
classic
liked it so much, I actually
compilations
bought
that I
it.
rented from Blockbuster.
That's another one of those games that, you'd be shaking by the time I got back after playing for an hour.
As the industry peaks, originality is a must.
Zaxxon.
The
That's a Sega
golden age
game.
of the arcade was incredible. The creativity, I've never seen
Frogger,
anything like it.
Konami.
Every game had to be original. 100% unique. This was the attitude at Atari. We didn't do driving games because there had been a driving game. If you did a driving game, it had to be a driving game with guns, and then there could only be one of those in the industry.
1942.
I had a friend who made a driving game where you drove on the ceiling because that was the only
1942
way
was
you
the
could get
Capcom
it through
game.
this corporate culture where 100%
Crystal
originality
Castles.
was applied.
The business of gaming looks good.
Yep.
Like today, where they're talking about how the game industry is eclipsing the motion picture industry in terms of revenue. That was very much the case back then as well.
Yep.
The revenue from
Serious.
video games was enormous. I mean, a good game would bring in 800 to 1,000 in a week. So you buy the game, and in 2 weeks, you pay off your, the distributor, and you're fine. And there were a lot of arcades, a lot of places where there were video games.
But the market can only grow so much. Soon, the arcade reaches critical mass and
Yep.
becomes a victim of its own success.
Ironically, when I arrived at Atari in 1982, we were saying, we're so big. The coin drop in these games is just as large as theatrical revenue for movies. Now, does that sound familiar? What had happened is we pretty much saturated the market. The games did not get obsolete very quickly, and we filled the arcades
In like
with them, and we were
1982,
starting to fill
1983, it
secondary
kind of wasn't
locations
really that
like
great there
Safeways
then either.
and 7-Elevens and dentist offices. By the middle of 1982, we were just full.
A lot of it was oversaturated in the market in 81, 82,
There have been some bad
especially
errors.
82-ish time frame. And we sold thousands and thousands of games. It went into dentist's office, besides normal arcades and street locations like bars and restaurants and bowling alleys. And it got to the point there were so many games out there that they couldn't support the amount of earnings to really justify buying them.
It was a fad.
That's another thing
I
right
think
there,
there's no other
Iceman.
way to put it. It was like early rock and roll, really. Enough people started coming and enough companies started making games, it just kept growing, and people built bigger and bigger ones until finally, the
Well,
whole thing
Commando
sort of
Street
collapsed
Fighter
under its
1.
own weight.
Now, the arcade machines that were so successful just a year ago are no longer making enough money to support
Stretch
the
the
market.
Pac-Man out.
By the time the early 80s came around, the economic life for a lot of games for simple games, and the simple games were those that everybody was playing, was probably less than a year. Well, the games cost enough that they really needed to have an economic model that would last for several years in order to pay for them.
And the home console market takes a bite out of the arcade as well.
Yeah,
The other
Atari
thing
was
that people
there.
will point out is that their home consoles started getting better about this point. The Atari 800 and other stuff started coming out. And the consoles, artwork used to be so different. The arcade would be here and consoles would be down here. The discrepancy started narrowing, and they started affecting our business.
Yeah, I definitely think the rise of the consoles really have hurt the arcade overall because there's just not much you can do on an arcade machine that you can't do on a home console.
Bloodied and bruised, the arcade market looks like it's down and out. But only time will tell.
But I will say the video game crash of '83 didn't exactly hurt arcades, like to the
By
point
the
where
mid-'80s, the days of arcade games
Like,
bringing in
arcades had
$1,000
its
a
own
week are
issues.
over, and
The
the
crash
coin-op
did not
industry is a
affect it.
mere shadow of what it once was.
affected the console
Many
industry.
companies such as Cinematronics are out of business. But Atari is still alive and still making arcade hits, such as Gauntlet and Marble Madness.
it kind of sounds like him. It's not, I don't think it's the same person.
Marble Madness was supposed to be sort of a video
It
game
kinda does sound like the
equivalent of
Nintendo Direct
miniature
guy.
golf. But, you know, putting didn't make a whole lot of
the
sense
former
in that
Nintendo Direct guy,
context, so
'cause
it
they have a
sort of
different person now.
evolved. The graphics stayed intact, but it kept on
Ah,
evolving.
Marble
and
Madness.
so
That
we got
was
the
actually a very interesting game.
trackballs for controllers, and we got enemies in there blocking your path, and it went to a time basis, sort of became a race game.
Boom.
You know, we have resurgence like Gauntlet came out. It came from several sources. My
The original
son was
Gauntlet
very
was
much
good,
into
too.
D&D at the time. It was very hot stuff to do, and you know that's where the original concept came from. You'll come out with two good games right in a row, and it's like, oh yes, we're riding high.
In
Street Fighter 2.
1991, the arcade experiences one of its greatest resurgences with Capcom's release of Street Fighter 2.
When the fighting games started to come back in the 90s, like, it was like an upturn, and you did start to see machines going into weird places again.
Yep.
I spent a lot of money on Street Fighter.
Oh, same.
You know, the Street Fighter
Same,
series
Destiny.
is 2D incarnation. Basically, it's lived on until to this day. And there's something very
There's so many
compelling about
different
that.
places I've been to over the years. There was a Nathan's Famous in Yonkers.
After Street Fighter 2 came out, there were nearly 600
Yu
new fighting
Suzuki.
games, but none of them could go beyond Street Fighter.
But as successful as the Street Fighter series and its fellow
Yeah, that's the
fighting
one I'm
games
talking
are,
about,
it
Destiny.
isn't enough to fully revitalize the market.
Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter.
We're gonna watch the
These were
fighting games one
that
later.
Took a lot of coordination, and it excluded two major classes of people: the casual gamer, the businessman that wanted to play on his lunch hour, and women. They were very
Yeah, that Nathan's
complex,
is
and so
small
the
now.
casual gamer didn't want to spend their life figuring out how to punch, kick, and fight somebody to death and knock their heads off.
The problem with fighting games was that there was a period of maybe like a year where anyone could get into fighting games, and after that, it was hard for like somebody new to walk in the arcade and not just get their ass kicked and just get laughed out of the place. It was kind of a feedback loop that kept new people from
Unless
getting
you want to
into
be
it after a while.
dedicated.
To stay alive, the arcade must evolve.
A single quarter was not enough revenue for a game to earn. We ultimately figured out that we needed a buck, and we don't have dollar coins in the States. A buck is a big spend. It's not a casual spend, and so we needed a new generation of arcade games to show how this should be done. And Yu Suzuki was the big player there. Hang On, Outrun, R360, he had it down.
Yu Suzuki from Sega is considered one of the pioneers for arcade games in the early 90s.
Yu Suzuki transformed the video game business. If you look at the period of time from when he started making these simulators,
By the time this episode was made,
1995, Sega
they weren't
dominated
as
the
common.
arcades.
Like we had the gold dollars a few years after.
Since I created Hang On, a lot of people were getting more and more into games where you just don't use a joystick. It becomes a physical experience. You need a moving cabinet. That was very important. And the hardware manufacturers were challenging more and more complicated movements.
Well, it just makes the experience all the more real, right?
Kind of feels like if you're in
What
some
it
sort of
does
an
is
indoor music
it tends
park.
to heighten the gameplay experience. It takes some imagination to kind of, put those things together. The arcade industry is great because of, these unique things.
I think this is more pushing the envelope of human capacity
It kinda
rather than
does.
the industry itself.
With a normal console, right? You're just kind of limited to your controller, and there's some add-ons.
Dance Dance Revolution.
Dance Dance Revolution or games like that. To have that custom piece of equipment, it adds a whole nother gameplay element,
My
a whole nother
brother
experience.
spent so much
Takes it to a
time
deeper
playing
level.
Dance Dance Revolution for so many years. Watching him play DR was always a sight to see.
While it looks like the arcade may never reclaim its former glory, some people still think it has a future.
There's still a huge following for
What you're going
DVR.
to see in terms of arcade games in the future is just
Even though
more
DVR
things
isn't
that
as
are
big
like,
as it used to be.
the larger machines.
Like ride simulators.
Yep.
You know, there's something about a driving game where you actually have a steering wheel and pedals that you can't really duplicate at home, even with the wheel and pedals, and just the larger kind of location-based entertainment machines.
Yeah, there is. There are arcades out there, and Sega actually was very forward-thinking in this.
Like
Theme parks, or
like
even
the
just,
light
say,
green
like on a
games
boardwalk somewhere,
that you can
or
just sit down.
specifically downtown somewhere. There's a game center.
Make it look like a cart.
But the idea there is to give you an experience that you can't get at home.
I always thought there was a future. I just thought it would be so small. You know,
It was just
there'd
trying
be
to find
enough
ways to hook you
arcades
into
where people
arcades.
want to go, you know, people to hang out, or bars. You can have a drink in one
Mostly
hand
the
and play a
casual
game with
gamer.
another. Just entertainment.
But no matter what happens, the people who were there in the beginning will never forget the time when a quarter was all you needed to be a gamer.
Nowadays, arcades are nowhere near as big
Actually,
as
it's
they
great making
used to
the games
be.
because, for one thing, we were all a little club. There were about 150 game creators in the entire business at that point. We mostly knew each other, too, whether we were at Atari or Williams or Bally or the like.
Oh, yeah, Bally.
When you went to an arcade, there was this great rush you'd get because you make your game and you put it in there with all the other new games, usually by guys that you knew, and
the
you'd see
company
just how much
Bally
money your game could make.
had
in a movie.
arcades,
It
they
was
had
great.
a lot of entertainment and music stuff. The only thing that lasted the longest with Bally was the
a
fitness.
really good feeling. More importantly
Like the
is
fitness centers.
when you go in there and see
Those
the
were the ones that
expressions on
lasted the
people's
longest.
faces. I remember the first time we tested Millipede, and some gal walked up, and she was a centipede player, and she was very good at it. And she got to the point where, you know, all the insects were flying down the screen, and it just expression face of, oh, you know, it's panic. That was worth it for a game designer, and for, you know, testing. That's the kind of expression you want to pull off.
What you can't get, of course, and this is what I really miss about arcades, is just the notion of going into this crazy, dark, loud place. It's just lit by screens and filled with all the music of the games and, you know, sticky Coke on the floor and stuff like that. I mean, to me, that's just an amazing experience that you can never really have again.
That's the arcade episode. Now arcades are more limited to stuff like Dave & Buster's and Round 1, or if you go to like a barcade. Sometimes you might be lucky, but most of the time, like, they're just nowhere near as big as they used to be. So the next episode that we're gonna be watching is we're gonna be watching Game Boy next.
It started with a man.
Gunpei Yokoi turns out to be
Gunpei Yokoi.
Jonathan Swift / Cervantes / William Shakespeare of video games.
Who wanted to take gaming on the go.
That really was.
It was Yokoi's team that looked at
We jumped
miniaturization.
from
Everything the
arcades
NES does,
to Game
we
Boy.
can do in this little handheld unit.
He met with his
There's
share
actually a
of
very sad
disappointment.
story in this.
It's a cool invention, great thought, probably not a good idea at the end of the day.
Gunpei Yokoi was in the doghouse at this point. His system had bombed.
Stop. And created something that exceeded everyone's expectations.
The GBA is definitely the most successful console in the history of mankind.
That is true, Destiny.
This is the story behind the best-selling game system ever created. And the man behind it. It's the story of Nintendo Game Boy.
Best-selling game system ever created? Not anymore. No, the top 3 now is PS2, Nintendo DS, and Nintendo Switch. That's the top 3, yeah.
Game Boy doesn't just lead the handheld gaming
But
market.
of course, at the time it was Game Boy.
It owns it.
I wonder where he'd be if he was still alive. Hard to say. It's really hard to say. More likely retired at best.
The year is 1965. And a successful entrepreneur named Hiroshi Yamauchi is at the head of a playing card manufacturer named Nintendo.
The Hanafuda cards.
At the time, Nintendo was completely and totally run by Mr. Yamauchi. He made all the decisions, and any decision made by anyone else was always run by him.
This guy was very stern. He was pretty much an asshole.
He's a very
but he was a
stern
businessman first and foremost.
Very shrewd, very smart. I would say he's, he is a genius, but a tough businessman.
Yes.
Yamauchi-san is a hard ass. I think that's the best way to describe his style of management.
But it was his grandfather or great-grandfather that did.
From his troop and from his team.
At the time, he was 100% in control of every detail, and so everything
he just
had to go
inherited
through him.
Nintendo.
And a young technician from Kyoto comes on board to maintain Nintendo's factory machinery.
Their plant technician, the guy who made sure that the assembly belt
was a family
properly,
business at
that
first.
the plant equipment was working properly, was this guy named Gunpei Yokoi. Quiet guy, unassuming guy, very smart guy, very loyal, dedicated guy, who at night liked to go home and experiment at making toys.
It's not long before Gunpei's experimenting gets him noticed.
Yamauchi came to him and said, "Do you think you could make a toy for us to sell?" Now in America, we'd say, "Sure, what's in it for me?" That didn't occur to Gunpei Yokoi. He said, "Sure." And he came back with some of the inventions he'd made.
His first invention was like this mechanical arm.
The Ultra
that,
Hand.
was basically just would grab things. And that was one of the early things that he developed for Nintendo, and it sold pretty well.
The footage
toy
is from
called
WarioWare.
the Ultra Hand is released in 1970 and sells over 1 million units that holiday season.
Toys didn't have to be brilliant back then. They just had to be simple and fun and easy to
There was a
manufacture.
WiiWare
And
game,
This was
Grill
in the
Off for your Ultra Hand.
Japan taking over the world period, so there wasn't a lot of money. Cheap was good. Yokoi's toys worked well. They sold well. But Yamauchi saw that there was something special about Yokoi, that he had a great creativity. The other thing that's really remarkable about Yokoi, he was very charismatic. Gunpei Yokoi turns out to be the Jonathan Swift / Cervantes / William Shakespeare of video games.
On August 28, 1980, Nintendo releases another of Gunpei Yokoi's inventions, the Game & Watch.
So in the beginning, he came up with the Game & Watch unit and made himself a name at Nintendo. And he kind of expanded that product as the years passed. He added a 2-screen Game & Watch unit that was very popular.
This was the period where Mattel and Coleco were battling with light diode football games and racing games.
The Game
and
&
here,
Watch.
using LCD screens, they added a little more image to them. Nintendo wasn't the only company doing these at the time. A number of companies did.
Timeout electronic games from Mego. All tell time and are so slim, you'll play them anywhere.
The Nintendo units were usually a little more expensive, but they were usually a little better made and they were a little more creative.
With classics such as Manhole and Donkey Kong, the Game & Watch line continues for nearly 10 years, selling more than 40 million units. Yokoi becomes a star player at Nintendo.
Yep.
My understanding was that Gunpei Yokoi really had Yamauchi's ear. That when Yokoi suggested something, the engineers were always behind him. He delivered on what he said he could do, always. Always, always, always. When he said he could make something, he made it. And he made it cheaply. And that was enough for Yamauchi.
In 1983, Nintendo releases a video game console called the Famicom in Japan. It comes to the US in 1985 as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The new console is a hit.
Yep.
In both countries, and will go on to sell 50 million units in its lifetime. Gunpei Yokoi turns his focus to bringing the power of the NES to the palm of your hand.
Somewhere in the
Gunpei Yokoi
high
came up with the idea for Game Boy. As far as the development goes, this was done out of his team.
Gunpei Yokoi's R&D 1 team, which is also responsible for the NES classic Metroid, gets to work.
The inspiration for Game Boy definitely was Game & Watch territory. It was basically taking console gaming and merging it with the whole Game & Watch handheld craze.
What Yokoi doesn't realize is that their little NES has a big future. In 1989, Gunpei Yokoi is finishing up work on a special project.
The motivation to create Game Boy was that the NES or the Famicom was a world power. Nintendo owned between 93 and 97% of the world console market by 1989, and the world console market was huge. It was huge. So they said, well, look, here's a chance for us to go from just this little piece of business to a much bigger piece of business.
Portable Game Boy is launched with an initial selling price of $169.99.
Game Boy had a worldwide launch. Game Boys almost always have had worldwide launches. The launch of Game Boy was tremendous. The world was in love with Nintendo. The United States was in love with Nintendo. It was an immediate hit. It came out, people bought it, It immediately expanded their business.
And the Game Boy has an unstoppable ally, a game called Tetris.
Yep, Tetris.
The initial success of the Game Boy was due to Tetris. A fantastic game and a brilliant business decision for Nintendo to bundle it.
Tetris was very, very instrumental to the success of the Game Boy, simply because it was on the Game Boy at the right time. I wouldn't say that the Game Boy wouldn't be what it is today had it not been for Tetris, but it certainly helped really jumpstart and accelerate the Game Boy audience growth.
They had Tetris, you can't underestimate that as, you know, sort of a factor in the original Game Boy's success.
Nintendo also has a stable of NES games that are perfect for the Game Boy.
Yep.
When Game Boy launched, Nintendo went back to the well a little bit. NES had come out in America in 1985, 86 was when it went coast to coast. And it had NES Baseball, it had an NES Tennis, there was a golf game. Nintendo went back to a lot of these very easy games and ported them over to Game Boy. But the launch titles looked an awful lot like launch titles for the NES.
They did.
But it doesn't take long for competition to appear.
Atari came out with Lynx at the same time that Game Boy came out, and they had to be thanking their lucky stars over at Atari because, you know, here comes Game Boy, little tiny screen, black and white, very low resolution. They said, you know, they'd gotten to go see a demonstration of Game Boy. I like Game Boy. And they laughed and laughed and laughed till they cried because the thing was so pathetic. What they didn't realize, and what Nintendo has always focused on, was if you're going to play a portable game, people are thinking cheap. They're thinking convenient.
One of the key advantages of the Game Boy was that it was low cost and that it didn't have any moving parts in it, so there wasn't a disk drive or anything. It was all cartridge based, and it didn't have a light in it. So you could play Game Boy games for a very long time, and that's very important for the target group of the Game Boy. It was kids. You could take out a Lynx and play for 2 hours maybe, and you would have to either carry some spare batteries or run back home and get some. And for going on trips or being on a long bus ride and a train ride, it just wasn't feasible.
Although the Lynx was technically a more powerful system, it quickly finds itself in bargain bins.
Yeah, because
while Game Boy sales continued to climb.
Game
in
Boy
1991, Sega and NEC also
and
entered the handheld market.
Game Gear was similar in that it had a really cool screen. You could even watch TV on it. It just looked great. But in order for the screen to be that great, it had to be powered by a lot of battery power. And that meant that the batteries didn't last very long.
And then at the same time, NEC came out with its Turbo Express. Again, a better screen, color screen, backlit screen, but it's playing actual console games.
I never had a game.
The problem is both of these units cost more than Game Boy. Even though the NEC Turbo Express played console games, the library was nowhere near the size of the Game Boy library. And you gotta harp on the battery life again.
Thanks to longer battery life, a larger selection of great games, and a cheaper price point, the Game Boy comes out on top, selling 32 million units by 1992. Meanwhile, the Lynx, Game Gear, and Turbo Express become things of the past. But how much longer will a relatively simple Game Boy be able to stay on top?
That's the thing, because Game Boy ended up just... the Game Boy never really got toppled by anybody.
Nearly 5 years after its 1989 launch,
Many
and
have
more
tried.
than 50 million units later, the Game Boy gets the first of many upgrades, the Super Game Boy.
Super Game Boy, you can play a Super Nintendo.
1994, the first jump for Game Boy was the Super Game Boy. Super Game Boy was a peripheral that you could put in your Super NES that would let you play Game Boy games on Super NES. Now, if you can think of anything that would be dumber, instead of playing these big, beautiful, full-color, highly detailed Super NES games, you could now play these $19 Game Boy games on your Super NES. It did not make a lot of sense. At the same time, Sega came out with 32X. It gave you more color, it gave you better sound, it gave you bigger games.
It's not the same
that
thing,
made sense.
really.
It made a lot of sense, right? So what happens? Sega sold 300,000 32Xs. Super Game Boy sales were in the millions, multiple millions. Who could figure out why? But people wanted to play their Game Boy games on the big TV. Jagged as they looked, it was pretty stupid stuff, but people bought it.
It was a good idea.
Snatched it up. It brought some new life to the Game Boy.
In 1995, color finally comes to the little handheld that could, but not in the form of a color screen.
Another thing that brought new life was not Game Boy Color, but Color Game Boy. Game Boy came out in 1989. For a while, it was really hot, and then it became a backwater for a while. So they came out first with Color Game Boy. And I still remember Peter Main, the vice president of Nintendo, standing up at CES and saying, you know, you people are always asking, when are we going to come out with a Color Game Boy? Well, here it is. What Color Game Boy was Game Boys with colored outsides.
Yeah.
You know, ha ha ha, funny joke there,
I would have
Peter.
wanted the red one.
Weird as
a
it
kid.
sounds, people
or the
liked
translucent
it.
one.
It brought Game Boy sales up. Go figure.
Yeah, I started with a pocket. I almost got the original brick.
The next step for the Game Boy was to become smaller.
6 years after the original Game Boy came out, Nintendo released the Game Boy Pocket. What it was kind of a tweaked version of the original system. Even though, you know, you might not immediately notice the contrast of the screen itself were just much better. You could see much more. The screen didn't blur as easily when you moved. So with this Pocket upgrade, you get a much smaller unit, a unit that used smaller batteries, something that you could put in your pocket and really bring along with you.
It looks like Nintendo just can't lose, but that changes in 1995 when the father of Game Boy, Gunpei Yokoi, releases what will become Nintendo's biggest flop.
Yep, here we go.
The Virtual Boy.
He was interested in the experiment about, could you make games 3D? Could you actually make it so that instead of feeling like you were looking at an image, you were looking at an object.
The Virtual Boy.
And that was kind of the impetus.
The whole Virtual Boy debacle was a very interesting one, especially because I was privy to more information than many people. The Virtual Boy had very few redeeming features. It wasn't
since the
proper
Virtual
3D.
Boy
It was only in red.
It was
attached to a tabletop.
in the same way Virtual Boy did.
Movable. It wasn't portable or lightweight or anything. There was just nothing redeeming about it. And the ultimate frustration for me was that they had a much better system in development that got cancelled that might have been successful. You never know. But the Virtual Boy certainly has no chance of
I know what he's talking
success
about. Let me explain about that real
decisions
quick.
that
Okay, so I want to explain something real quick. So they did actually had something in development in the 90s, which that idea did not get realized until the Game Boy Advance. But the idea was to originally have the Nintendo PlayStation. No, they actually, well, yes, but no, I'm not referring to that. They actually had a handheld that was in the works back in the 90s. And it was supposed to be significantly more powerful than the Game Boy. I'm trying to remember what was the name of it, but it never came to be. Like it never saw the light of day. Like the Game Boy Advance is basically the closest thing. Project Atlantis. I just found it. Project Atlantis. Basically it was gonna be a Game Boy that was supposed to play games that were kind of like 16 bits. And it was supposed to release sometime in 96 or 97, and it did not see the light of day at all. So, yeah.
It didn't really sell that well.
I just want to
throw
that one out there.
Because you look into it and it was red, it was flickery, and if you played it for too long, I think your eyes might melt.
Because you were staring at red and black and only red and black for a long time, people tended to get dizzy.
It should have been black and white,
for like more than an hour. When you looked away, you couldn't see red anymore.
Red and black was not a good choice.
It's a cool invention, great thought, probably not a good idea at the end of the day.
Because of the Virtual Boy's abysmal performance, Yokoi is left behind in favor of other designers.
Gunpei Yokoi was in the doghouse at this point. His system had bombed.
In corporate Japan, there's something called a window seat. And a window seat basically is you screwed up, you did something wrong, and instead of firing you or reprimanding you every day or giving you another chance. They basically let you sit by the window and occupy you with something, but not really let you make decisions that affect the company. And that's exactly what happened to Yokoi. He got a window seat.
So it was a pretty tough time. You have Yokoi, and they're leaving him with this disaster. They're saying, you are going to man this disaster, and you will be ignored. No one's going to come talk to you. You're going to be associated with this joke of a system, while everyone else is going to look at our big N64, the system of the future.
Gunpei's first big failure has him down, but his sights are set on starting something new.
I feel like they kind of blew that out of proportion. I'm talking about Icons. I don't think he was that deep in the doghouse, but he did kind of. But they were not really happy with him.
Nintendo has grown bigger than ever, and with that growth comes a change in focus to bigger projects, such as the Nintendo 64. This powerful new system overshadows the failed Virtual Boy. In August of that year, Gunpei Yokoi decides to leave the Japanese gaming giant and start his own company.
He was sitting there working on stuff that had no consequence, stuff that wouldn't make Nintendo a lot of money, it wouldn't exactly change the world. So Yokoi got bored and in the end left the company.
It wasn't too much longer that he started Koto. While he was at Koto, he did what he always did. He created a new game system, the Wonder Swan.
Tragically, on October 4th, 1997, Gunpei Yokoi is struck and killed by a car in Japan. His death is felt throughout the industry.
He was also a father and a husband and very much in love with his children.
The name Gunpei Yokoi was synonymous with handheld gaming. And for this person to get to get killed in a car accident, die such a meaningless death, I think the industry was just shaken up completely,
Yokoi's legacy lives on in his creations, and Nintendo continues to build on his greatest invention.
Nintendo had been working on color Game Boys for many, many years before the color Game Boy actually came out. They had a policy, quite rightly, that they wouldn't release a color system until they could have almost as good battery life as their black and white system.
But color isn't the only innovation for the Game Boy.
I think
that one of the other things that has contributed to the success of the Game Boy has been matching great software titles with the different platforms. I mean, with Game Boy Color, that came out and we were able to launch that essentially with the Pokemon games.
Pokemon was a phenomenal success and an amazing game, perfect for the Game Boy.
Pokemon.
They're great games, and I think they really helped draw audiences in and convince them to buy the hardware.
The success of Pokemon puts a Game Boy in the hands of nearly every kid in America. But Nintendo is already thinking about the next step.
Nintendo actually had, it was called Project Atlantis. That was the original code name
they talk
for
about it.
The Game Boy Advance. It was actually ready a lot longer before they released it, but they didn't want to release it because the Game Boy Color was selling so well.
By June 11th, 2001, Nintendo is finally ready to release the next generation Game Boy to the masses.
Pokemon Company is a bigger can of worms.
It only takes 4 days for the new system to sell more than 500,000 units at just $99 a piece.
Game Boy Advance
Pretty much anyone can buy the Game Boy Advance, and we've really tried to take the technological capabilities of Game Boy and improve upon them while keeping them within reach of the average consumer.
With the Game Boy player.
The Game Boy family has a new addition.
Game Boy Advance
screen-lighted, flip design model we're calling Game Boy Advance SP.
To everybody in chat, if you had a Game Boy Advance SP, what color did you have?
In just 1 year,
I have the red one.
6.5 million units
My
of the new
brother had the
handheld
blue.
are sold.
Well, the Game Boy Advance SP, of course, is the culmination of 14 years of great Game Boy fun. It's front-lighted, it's got a rechargeable battery, it's got everything game players have been asking for.
In 2003, Gunpei Yokoi's accomplishments are honored at the Game Developers' Choice Awards.
For lifetime achievement. If my father were able to attend the ceremony, the joy that I could feel as his son would have been something no words of mine could ever express. To him, and thank my Father in heaven, to whom I have an ever-increasing feeling of love and respect.
Nintendo continues to push the envelope of portable game design with the DS.
that this
DS.
is not a replacement for Game Boy. For Nintendo, DS is an interesting experiment.
The DS turns
the
20
future
this
for
year.
Game Boy is the Game Boy is going to get smaller and cheaper.
In the past, there's been other handheld systems that have better technology, but for one reason or another, GBA
I
just,
love
like,
the
just
DS
plowed
and
through them all
3DS.
and, like, totally dominated.
Today, the Game Boy series of handheld systems have sold more than 160 million units worldwide. Other companies are trying to challenge its dominance, like Sony's PSP.
Oh, the PSP.
But there's no denying that Nintendo's
PSP did
handheld
well,
is the
but
most
it
successful portable
could
game
not
system
bring down
in
the
history.
DS.
9 serious competitors have made a run
And
at
then
Game
Sony
Boy
made
the
the
past
Vita.
15 years, but 9 have failed. Game Boy doesn't just lead the handheld gaming market, it owns it.
It all started with Easter eggs.
Yeah. So that was the Game Boy episode. That was actually a pretty interesting episode. All right, so sorry it took so long, but the next episode is going to be, we're going to watch Mega Man.
Like every hero, he had obstacles to overcome.
And they said, there's no way this will sell.
You can watch, if you had
But
the
the
Mega Man
rewards
Anniversary
were great.
Collection on GameCube or Xbox, you got this.
they
The
didn't
PS2
have
version, you had the first
Mega
episode
Man,
of the
I
movie
don't even know
PS4
how they'd be surviving today,
Xbox had
honestly.
both.
Learn the secrets behind his power.
It's about one thing. And it's always about one thing, blasting.
Yeah, Xbox had both of them.
It's a huge cast of characters that any kid can enjoy.
Everybody loves Mega Man.
And meet Inafune.
I'm
the
no
man
fan of
behind
Inafune,
the
but he's
Mega.
much better person than the next
I had no
person,
idea
than
my luck
a
would
certain
go this
person we'll be
well.
watching
This
later.
character would be this great and last this long. So yes, it was a huge surprise for me.
No. Yeah. Yuji Naka.
In
1942.
1984, a Japanese video game company named Capcom hits its stride in the arcade scene with popular hits including 1942 and Gunsmoke. Their success allows them to expand, and a young artist named
You can play
Keiji Inafune
Gunsmoke
is
in
hired.
Capcom Arcade Second Stadium.
I've always
1942
liked
was
drawing
the first
pictures. From a long time ago, I've always wanted to be an illustrator. Just about at the time that I had graduated, video gaming companies were becoming very popular, and they had always wanted young, talented artists. And it was a good chance for me to break out, get into a company, and prove myself. So it just happened to be the right timing for me to
Take
be an
care, Aztec.
illustrator.
You have a good one.
Inafune goes to work on Capcom's newest arcade game.
The very, very first project I ever did was an arcade game called Street Fighter.
Yep, he worked in the art for Street Fighter 1.
Then after that, when we were doing the project, they said, we're working on a new title for the home consumer division, and we'd like you to participate in that. So it was at that time I joined the Mega Man project.
Yep.
And the hunt for the hero turns personal.
A lot of the character design for Mega Man is based upon some of the Japanese cartoons that I
Speed
saw when
Racer.
I was a child. I've always liked the images and the art, and when I was making this game, it was kind of like a going back to my roots, going back to my childhood when I designed it. It was very fun to design that character.
And that character needs a name.
Before it was Rockman, it was originally going to be Mighty Kid.
Yep.
Or Knuckle Kid, and this is how we were doing the package.
And also Rainbow Kid or Rainbow Man.
So we decided on Rockman. And in the end, it did become the States Mega Man.
So there's a reason why that Mega Man was called Mega Man in North America and outside of Japan. There's a reason for that. There are two. One was there was actually a trademark for the name Rockman already, but it was for like one of those plug in the wall guitar, like electric guitars that they had back in the 80s. That's number one. And number two was that Capcom USA executives at that time didn't really like the name Rockman, and they wanted to go with something different. They felt Mega Man was a better choice. So that's why he's named Mega Man outside of Japan.
Actually, it's not a rock like a stone or a pebble. That was not where the name Rockman comes from. It comes from rock and roll. There's also another character named Roll.
Yep. Roll
when
being
I first designed the character, I had rock and roll in mind. That was the back image I was going off of when I designed a lot of the artwork. For me, Rockman, or Mega Man, has always been a game that's been designed with music in mind. Music's always been a very important part of the series.
And just like Mega Man, even his creators show weakness.
Yep.
This is Mega Man 1, all the original bosses that I drew with my own two hands.
The Mega Man 1 bosses.
When I look at it now, I think, man, I really wasn't that good, was I? If one of my character designers that work underneath me now were to bring
I don't think
something
those are
to
the
me, I'd
original
probably take one look and say, no way. This
I
sucks,
think
try
those are
again.
more recent sketches.
With the
he made
characters
for
and story in
this-
place, it's
for
time
this
to rock and
episode.
roll.
Basically, when you think about it, there's not something in the world that is just stronger than everybody else. Almost everything has something it's stronger than and something that it's weaker to. Sort of like in scissors, rock, and paper. Scissors will beat paper, but it loses to the rock. Paper will beat the rock, but it loses to the scissors. So that's how the Mega Man weapons work.
And now it's time to introduce the twist.
Well, the whole idea behind Mega Man was you defeat one boss, and then you go to the next boss by using the weapon you just gained.
They also give players a new kind of freedom.
The original Mega Man game was interesting because it was one of the first games that allowed you to choose what level you played first. It was a linear platform game like a lot of other platform games, but you had a lot of freedom up front to choose the path that you wanted to take through the game.
With Mega Man, they were giving the player something to look forward to.
Mega
An
Man
element of
1
strategy,
was
which most games
definitely
back then really didn't have.
Once the game is
First
finished,
game
Inafune has to face
syndrome.
his own bosses.
After we got the game done, we took it over to sales. And we said, look, we got the game done, this is what it's like. And they said, there's no way this will sell.
Yep.
So I was really disappointed, of course. I was like, well, I tried my best, my hardest, really, really worked hard at it, and it didn't work out.
Yeah.
Capcom decides to release the game in Japan in a limited amount. Surprising everyone, the game catches on in Japan. Capcom decides to bring the little robot to America. Before they cross cultures, they make a few changes.
Boy, here we go.
And like they say, it's what's on the inside that really counts.
That it had some of the worst box art in the history of video games. It doesn't look anything near the Mega Man that we see today.
The box art for the first Mega Man game in the U.S. was done very quickly.
You want to know whose fault is it that Capcom made the bad box art?
And he went out and got a friend of his.
It's not
to do it in
Capcom's fault,
6
actually.
hours. And that's
Like,
the
it's not
reason why it
Capcom
turned out so
USA's
bad.
fault.
They
You
had
want to know
some
whose fault it was?
45-year-old guy with a strange-looking weapon.
Despite the
Nintendo.
cover, word begins to spread. And
Because
sales
they
of Mega
wanted
Man
they
begin
wanted
to gain
Capcom to release
momentum.
the game as soon as
First Mega
possible
Man
because
was
it
indeed
was going
a
to release in
hit.
December.
Word of mouth really caught on with the Mega Man.
The
to
Mega
release
Man
the game
team
on
begins
time.
to work on the sequel, but this time with a little extra help.
And also keep in mind, specifically Nintendo of
We were
America.
waiting for everyone's ideas for
Nintendo of
enemies.
America.
There was a contest
Because they were like,
Nintendo
we want the
Power where
box,
kids
we
could
want
create
the
robot
artwork and
monsters for the
everything
game.
the next day.
From 2, we had children participating in the
So they
R&D
rushed
of
the
the
box
game.
art.
So you really have the game kind of created by children for children. You have that child touch, actually.
When the sequel arrives in America in
Mega Man 2
1989,
had
there's
the
already a captive
Japanese
audience ready to
campaign.
face the evil Dr. Wily.
They got the free
If I
copy
were
of the
to
game
have to
and some
throw
other
out
prizes.
One single Mega Man title
The
that I really
runners-up were
liked,
also in the
I guess it would
credits.
be Mega Man 2. It was probably the one game where I really, really felt that I had put in 100% of everything that I was aiming for. Out of all the games I've made, one of the best ones. I really liked it.
I believe there was
Capcom,
a
realizing the potential of the
there
game,
was a
throws their
manga
weight
artist that
behind the
actually
series.
drew a
When I
robot
made the
master
first
that
Mega
got
Man,
selected.
You're
I
always
forgot
limited
who
by
it was.
memory, how much space you have on the cartridges. And we had tons of
Let me
characters that
actually
we had created that we all wanted to fit in the first game that we couldn't. So all the characters that were left over, we decided to put in number 2. A lot of the characters became a lot more bright and colorful. The sprites were a lot prettier in the second one. We were able to do a
Yusuke
lot of
Murata,
things that we couldn't do in the
illustrator
first
of the
one.
manga
The
I
game
Shield
is popular,
21 and
selling
One
more
Punch
copies
Man.
than the original and ensuring that the Blue Bomber will return.
Mega Man and Street Fighter came out around the same time, are responsible for, Capcom. They branded Capcom. They made them a company to be reckoned with. People didn't really know
He made Dustman in Mega Man 4 and Crystal Man in Mega Man 5.
With the success of 2 Mega Man games, Capcom rushes to release number 3.
When
He created a robot master named Double Man for Mega Man 3
They kept coming out in progression
for that contest, but didn't
one
win.
After the other after the other. The Capcom didn't waste
But he
any
was
time.
listed in the credits.
They might not have known they
Hey,
had
Arts
it
and
on
Fights,
their
good to
hands,
see
but
you.
once they did, it was immediate.
Yeah, because Akira
Mega Man is
Kitamura
on
left.
a roll, but Capcom's next move will be a frustrating one.
Yep. And here we go. The transition from 8 to 16-bit, while Mega Man
In
stood in the NES.
1991, Nintendo releases the Super Nintendo, an updated version of their aging console system, with the arrival of better graphics and sound.
Like,
classic 8-bit games are given new life in a 16-bit world.
Like Zelda.
But one character is nowhere to be seen.
I think they continued to do Mega Man games for the NES because, first of all, it was easy to do. It was inexpensive for them to develop additional Mega Man games. All 6 of the Mega Man games for the NES use the same character animation.
They do.
They have different music, different backgrounds, different enemies, different things to do.
But you can tell as the games go
basically
on, they
the
put
same
more
engine.
detail on how
They
the
got
games
it right
look.
the first time, and they just continued to do it.
Like, put Mega Man 1 and Mega Man
They
6
didn't
side
wanna
by
mess
side
with
with
the
each other.
formula. Capcom's famous
But
for not
hope you're doing well,
messing
fights.
with a good thing. And at the time, Mega Man 2 had done outrageous numbers, and 3 did fairly well.
Yeah.
And they figured, why mess with a good thing?
So,
yeah, like
they
maybe
did it
the
because
decision
not
seemed a little weird.
the thing
now.
is because not everybody
at the time, the installed
made
base
the
of
jump to
Nintendo
Super
was
Nintendo, yeah.
outrageous. It was huge. So why wouldn't you want to release a new Nintendo game with your all-star Mega Man?
Mega Man 4
I can
blasts
understand
its
with
way
4.
onto shelves in 1991.
But 5 and 6?
However, many people are
Nah.
beginning to move on to the newer system, leaving the Blue Bomber
Yeah,
with a
Mega
shrinking
Man
fan
6
base.
had those 2 robot masters.
Mega Man 5 is
Yeah,
released
Nightman
in
and Windman.
1992.
One was from Canada, one's from the United States.
And Mega Man 6 hits the shelves a year later with little fanfare. The future looks bleak for the little robot.
Boom.
But in true video game
This was the
style,
first
he's
episode of
about to get
Icons I've
another
seen
life.
because
By
it was on the GameCube disc
1994,
for
Capcom
Anniversary
has
Collection.
quite a bit of experience making games for the Super Nintendo. They know that they will have to do more than just re-release older games on the new system. Mega Man needs a makeover.
I guess with every system you have to have some sort of major evolution because graphically you can do so much more. And the cool thing about Mega Man is he didn't go into 3D because you couldn't really quite
ad for
yet.
Bonsai.
So instead what Capcom did was just give him a makeover and make him Mega Man X.
Using elements of the original series, Capcom's designers add new moves. And new
Mega Man
characters
X
to give
is easily
gamers
one
a
of the best
different
games
experience.
Yeah, the Mega Man X series was very different from the originals. It still had the same type of gameplay.
Dude, when I got
character was
the Mega
similar.
Man Anniversary Collection for GameCube,
But it
I
took
loved
place
it
in a
so
different time
much that I
frame.
was hoping
The Mega Man X games
for
are
the
harder.
for them to do a similar collection with the Mega Man X games. And then 2 years later, they did.
Tend to not like the Mega Man X series, mainly because it's really
And now we got the
hard.
Legacy Collections.
I feel like breaking my
So I
controller
could just
when
break
I play
out
them.
Mega Man
They're
Classic
much
or
more
X, whatever.
serious in tone. The boss characters in the original Mega Man games are a little more comical and lighthearted and more colorful. The Mega Man X characters are hard and metallic, and the games are, some of those games are brutally difficult.
Yet the game
Eventually.
finds its fans.
Eventually,
So
Destiny.
it was
I
this
think
really
Legends
cool
might be
techno
next.
quality to Mega Man. It was
Keep
really
in
neat.
mind-
Like all the bosses were a lot more extravagant.
When that Capcom ransomware leak
All the
happened,
sprites were a lot more
it
colorful.
turned out that there was the
Instead
source
of the
code for
basic
Misadventures
Flame
of
Man, you
Charmont.
had, like
So,
mantises and peacocks and all these really extravagant creatures and bosses that
they should put
that
the
you really didn't expect in
N64
the Mega Man
version of
universe.
Mega Man
But when they
Legends
make
on
a
there. Mega Man
flamingo robotic,
64.
it's
Like, have both
cool
the
for some
PlayStation
reason.
and N64.
Dr. Wily knew what he was doing.
Sigma, not Dr. Wily. Dr. Wily
Mega
was
Man
dead
X
by the time of
arrives in
Mega Man
stores in
X
1994.
took place.
And Mega Man fans take notice.
Sigma had to become the villain.
Mega Man's popularity
This
is
game
on
is
the
so
rise,
good.
and Capcom releases 2 games only a few months apart. Mega Man X2, and
X2's
Mega Man
good.
7.
Mega Man 7's good.
For the first time, Capcom allows two separate series to continue simultaneously, both the X series and the Classic series.
It got to a point where there was just a new Mega Man game coming out practically every year.
X4 is my
I don't know if
favorite.
everybody was on top of that and was just continuing to buy
X4 is
all
my
the
favorite Mega Man
games.
X game.
But the fact that there was a steady stream of games with that character in it, you know, really guaranteed that he would continue to be successful even when the newer systems started to come out.
Mega Man X3 arrives in stores less than a year later, but once again, the video game landscape is
X3
changing,
was a victim
and Mega
of
Man will soon
coming
find
out on the
himself
Super
homeless.
Nintendo very late. Yeah, Mega Man used
By
to be yearly.
1997, Nintendo has retired their Super Nintendo, and Sony's PlayStation is sending shockwaves through the industry. But Sony isn't exactly embracing Mega Man with open arms.
This is true.
I don't know if Sony's ever spoken about this policy on the record, but it's pretty well known that in the early days of the PlayStation, they really wanted to differentiate the PlayStation hardware from everything else that had come before it.
Yep.
And what that meant in a nutshell
3D games
was
like Crash
3D
Bandicoot.
games as opposed to 2D games, which is what the Super NES and the Genesis were really known for.
Sony does not like 2D games.
It's why the PS1
That
version
is very
of
important to
X3 did not come out
understand,
here.
From their original standpoint
It
on
was
the
Super Nintendo only
PlayStation.
here.
It was important for Capcom to continue its formula of what worked, and 2D was what worked for them. So
Yeah,
they
and Bernie
originally
Stoller
did not
carried it
want
over to when he
do
moved to
much for
Sega.
PlayStation because Sony did not want them to do anything for them.
They had that.
When Capcom
They still kept
approached
that
them
policy
with
even after
Mega
he was
Man
fired.
for the PlayStation in the US, and Sony
He got
shot him
fired for the
down.
no RPG thing.
Capcom still moves ahead, and to mark the 10th anniversary of the Blue Bomber, they decide to
Yeah.
release Mega Man 8, an update for the
Mega
Classic
Man 8.
series for the Sega Saturn.
This is more
Fearing the
underrated than
competition,
most other
Sony
Mega
also
Man
agrees
games.
to release
This is
the
really
game.
good Mega Man.
But they have a condition.
And Sony insisted that the PlayStation version of Mega Man 8 have something different, special, additional,
Yeah, but
that the Saturn version didn't
the
have.
PS1 version is more
They ended up
accessible
including a
because
commemorative
it's
booklet
it was
that
hard
showed
to
all the
emulate the
different boss
Saturn.
characters from various Mega Man games, just so that Sony could say, hey, the PlayStation
Yes,
version's
that's
got
true.
something the Saturn version doesn't have.
Mega Man finally arrives on Sony's
Not just
new
Mega Man 8,
console,
but also
his
Mega Man
next
X4.
jump will be an unexpected one.
And Sony knew that Resident Evil 2 was going to be a bigger hit. So they let Capcom... Okay, it's like... If you let us release Mega Man games on your system, we'll give you the Resident Evil 2 that you wanted.
In 1998,
They never dropped
Capcom follows up Mega Man's arrival on the
They're still
PlayStation
kinda
by agreeing to
anti-2D.
Sony's demand for a new look
They
at the
just don't
little
show it
robot.
now.
Wait a second. Where are you going, Mega Man? That's not the right way.
But the overhaul will take some work.
The Mega Man series
There's only one
is
place
originally a
that
2D
Capcom,
game,
that Mega Man
and, trying
works
to
better
transform
with.
that 2D game
And that's on a
into
Nintendo
3D
console.
world. How would Mega Man look as he's jumping in a 3D world? How would he
Yo,
look
Razzles
as
with the
he's
raid, thank you.
firing, running, all in this 3D world. So many different animations and movements you have to think about that aren't considered in 2D because they don't exist.
Mega Man belongs more with Nintendo
I was
than
going to have to
others.
say there's one particular trait about the Mega Man Legends series that really stands out.
But Legends was actually pretty good for what it
would have
was.
to be that you're on an adventure.
But yeah, I hope you had a good stream, Raswell.
Trying to put Rockman in this new 3D world and have him interact.
Yes,
with
Enigma, say the line.
in a believable fashion, and still
Red
have
Faction
all
2.
the fans think, yes, that is in fact the Mega Man that I'm used to playing as. Trying to
Hope
keep
you
that
enjoyed
image is
that,
very
Rascal.
difficult. It's a game that utilizes 3D, a really free world where you can go and do anything you really want to. It's not very linear.
Nope.
And with this adventurous
Not linear at all.
world inside the Mega Man Legends series, we figured
I
that
mean, kind of.
there's a lot of different kinds of action, not just destroying an enemy or defeating an enemy.
I mean, it kind of is linear, but at the same time, not. Stop dashing my hooks. But yeah, you're kind of right.
Other kinds of action are just, for example, walking down the road and maybe you kick a can or you shoot down a tree.
Because
or
this
something
came out on
like that.
PlayStation first, and then a few years later, they ported it to the
gave it a lot of freedom
S64.
and made it a lot more of a huge whole new world.
Well, so far so good. We're just watching
Legends series stand out.
G4's Icons, and right now we're watching the Mega Man
Legends is
episode.
definitely, I would say, is the
We
most
watched the
underrated
arcade
Mega Man
episode
game.
first,
I
then
mean,
the Game
it
Boy
took
one.
Mega Man kicking and screaming into 3D gaming.
Unfortunately, many don't agree.
The graphics were not state-of-the-art, but they were decent at the time, and still Mega Man fans picked up on. It didn't sell as well as the 2D games, but it was something that at least made Sony happy. It was 3D on their platform.
Yeah, this game was actually really good.
Boy, that new engine sure is something.
Oh, that shining
completely
laser
different from the old one.
Following the leap into the third dimension, Capcom begins to look for other video game genres for their star to explore.
And this is where we get something
First,
different.
Capcom sets their sights on the popular world of strategy gaming with the Mega Man Battle Network series.
The first game was what pushed me away from the series so many
Battle
times.
Network number 1. First of all,
but I'm glad I got through it.
There was never a game of its type before. There was no pattern to follow. No rough idea to go upon. If there was any type game, it was never really successful. They all failed. So to blend an action game,
Yeah, I got to do 5 and 6.
along with the kind of fun you get from the Pokemon games,
Because they were comparing this to Pokemon, and they also compared it to Yu-Gi-Oh!
or a Yu-Gi-Oh card game or something like that. To blend those two elements together, just the right amount.
Just having Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!
Make the game fun,
and then
yet
like
new and fresh.
I think they were trying to get those crowds
The combat
into
system in the
Mega Man Battle Network at the same
games is very
time.
different from what you see in a traditional Mega Man game. It's
Ironically
really an
enough,
interesting
Kids WB
variation
had
from the type
Pokemon,
of gameplay that
Yu-Gi-Oh!
Mega Man's known for.
and Mega Man Battle Network animes.
But
all the same
Capcom
lineup.
returns to the classic Mega Man style with the release of Mega Man Zero.
So if you were a GBA kid, you
Going
were
back
happy.
to that style of gameplay, it's a lot easier to
Mega
understand
Man
what
Zero.
you have to do when you go into a game like that cold and you just pick up
Zero
the controller
3's the
first
best
time.
one.
You run to the right and you beat guys up. You shoot. you
Zero
jump
1
on
is the
platforms.
weakest one because it's obviously the first
People
one.
are comfortable
It's
with
rough.
that.
It's just that it's still a good game. It's just that Zeros 2, 3, and 4 are obviously better.
In 2003, Capcom celebrates the 15th anniversary of its beloved character
15
and
years
releases
of Mega
updates
Man
to
at
all
the
3
time.
of its ongoing Mega Man series.
When this episode was made.
Mega Man X7.
X7. This one wasn't good.
Mega Man
I just
Network
did this one
Transmission.
recently. I finished this one the other day.
And Mega Man Zero 2.
Yeah, that was 2003.
After 15 years as one of the most revered game characters, he shows no signs of slowing.
So,
Mega
2003,
Man is Capcom's
we had
biggest selling
Mega
game
Man
series
Zero
of all
2,
time.
Mega Man Battle Network 3,
Mega Man is a very
Mega Man
appealing
Network
character.
Transmission,
He's got just the
Mega
right
Man
amount
and Bass
of
on the
zip
Game Boy
and
Advance,
power,
and Mega
but
Man
there are so many
X7.
different Mega Mans that you're always going to find one that appeals
All
to you.
of those came out in 2003.
Mega Man's still around today is because he's
So-
one of the staples of gaming history.
The 2000s was basically where Capcom released too much Mega Man, to the point where we got franchise fatigue.
I don't know.
He is
Hence the
what
fact that we got a
they live
hiatus.
on still. There are so many games and so many fans
Until
of Mega Man
Mega
that
Man
he's never going to die.
11, and now
I'm sure
Mega
they're going to
Man's
continue to do a lot
kind of
more
on a
and lot better
hiatus
Mega
outside
Man
of
games.
ports.
He's here to stay.
It's like, don't release the games all the time, but just when the time is right, do it.
I've been making Mega Man for about 15, 16 years now. That's a long time, but I still haven't had enough of him. He's a great character. I've always loved him, and I want to continue to keep making games with him in it. There's no reason to stop if you've got something good on your hands.
And Inafune has since left Capcom in 2010.
As you can see,
He
I have a lot
founded
of different,
Concept and
sketchbooks
Intercept.
here, and this isn't all
Both
of them.
companies are now acquired by Level 5. He made Mighty Number 9 from a Kickstarter. And while the Kickstarter was a success, the game, however,
There's a lot of enemy
was
characters
not
that have gone unused.
in terms of critical
The
reception.
ideas do keep coming.
And
So
did
many
not
books
sell
in a
well.
little time.
The 3DS and Vita versions of Mighty Number 9 were canceled. 2003 was when this episode was released. All right.
The person who probably taught me the most in the gaming industry about what it's like to make a game would probably have to be.
But now we're going to talk about.
Himself,
Now we're going to do
He really is a large part of my life.
the next episode we're going to watch. We're going to go from one video game industry figure to another.
To be playful.
Now we're going to watch Yuji Naka.
Blast processing. It was allegedly something that somehow made Sonic the Hedgehog go
I'll
faster.
just say this right now. Despite the fact that this is about Yuji Naka,
undoubtedly, I think Sonic was a system
honestly,
seller
it
for
shouldn't
Sega.
have been about
As
Yuji
a
Naka.
mascot back then,
It should have been
was
about
just huge.
Sonic.
And this hedgehog helped stir up some
Because there's more
headlines.
Sonic in this episode than anything about Yuji Naka, really.
The comparisons began.
Way more, but there's way more
It
about
became
Sonic.
Nintendo versus Sega, and the media wanted to compare them.
The lack of long-term success of the Dreamcast was kind of a disappointment. In some ways, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think everyone was a bit shocked at first that Nintendo and Sega had finally joined forces since they were mortal enemies for 10, 15 years.
I'd like to change. I'd like to move forward.
Meet the man behind Sonic, Yuji Naka.
He has lots of childlike qualities, which I think translates into his games.
Like Lotus.
And here we go. Now this one's about Yuji Naka. Started off with Sega and then he eventually left.
The Yuji Naka story begins on the other side of the world.
Well, when I was a child, I grew up in a place in Japan called Osaka up until I was 18. In terms of creativity, I like many things. I like cars, games, theme parks, everything. It's from all these things that I've been influenced. Well, I don't think I was too smart. I wasn't able to go to college. So after graduating from high school, I had to look for a job, and there were many candidates I targeted.
Of course not, but
They weren't looking for people, whereas Sega was. I lived in Osaka and I wanted to move to Tokyo, so I applied to Sega and they took me.
The 18-year-old entrepreneur goes to work on his first game for Sega, a game company already established thanks to arcade titles like Zaxxon.
1984 was when I joined Sega. Girls' Garden was the first game I was involved with. I was a programmer. It was the first game I worked on for the SG-1000.
Yep. The SG-1000 was Sega's first console.
In 1986, Sega introduces a brand new console, the Sega Master System. Naka works on games like F-16 Fighting Falcon.
The Master System, I thought at the time, you know, back then I certainly wasn't working in the game industry. I was just a, kid playing video games like everyone else. But I felt that box, the level of sophistication that it kind of oozed out of it was just a lot cooler than like Atari or Coleco.
They started to do
the F-16 Fighting Falcon game was back then, given the limited things he had to work with, I would say was very, very realistic for the time. And if you went back and played it now, I think you'd have the same feeling.
And Phantasy Star, a role-playing game filled with solid quests and masterful stories.
I think at the time, Phantasy Star was fairly different
This
type
game
of kind of
came
RPG,
out
and I don't think we can say that now.
from the original
the games
Final
coming out,
Fantasy.
a lot of them seem to be
And
similar,
I think Shin Megami
or a lot of the things
Tensei, or rather just
borrow
Megami
concepts
Tensei.
from one another. But I think back then it was just very fresh.
3 RPGs coming out close to each
Made
other.
you want to play it over and over again.
In 1987.
Phantasy Star 2 is released in 1989 and features an inventive storyline and realistic graphics with the power of Sega's new 16-bit console, the Genesis.
I was clearly a Genesis guy. If it weren't for the Genesis, I wouldn't even be in the video game industry.
Nintendo releases their own console,
there were
the Super
four of them.
NES, and a rivalry is born.
Online games.
Yeah, the 16-bit console wars, I mean, that was a sort of a famous era in video games because you had Nintendo kind of unwilling to release a successor to the NES. They didn't want to shoot that golden goose that was already still laying golden eggs. And unfortunately for them, that gave Sega, just kind of a very small challenger, an opportunity to like come in with the Genesis.
For the Super NES, Nintendo introduces a series of games featuring Mario, created by Shigeru Miyamoto. The series becomes wildly popular. Naka begins collaborating with character designer Oshima and has an idea he hopes can compete with the Little Plumber.
To come up with the character of Sonic, we asked ourselves, what kind of game do we want to make? Back then, Mario existed and he jumped a lot, jumping and hitting blocks. But what I wanted to do was get involved with creating a smoother surface to run across and have the character run fast. I was the main programmer. The most important thing was I wanted it to be playful. So we built characters to match the playfulness.
The result is Sonic the Hedgehog, released in 1991. and the Sonic team is formed, led by its creator.
Since I'm the president of Sonic Team, I'm involved in every aspect. The visuals, story, and gameplay.
I've actually played Sonic 1
I believe the games must represent Sonic Team in a good way.
The Sonic team is determined to make Sonic stand out in the crowd.
Well, blast processing was like the marketing term for Sonic the Hedgehog, and it was allegedly something that somehow made Sonic the Hedgehog go faster. Was it ever more than a marketing term? I don't think so, so who knows. But it definitely worked good in the ads, but I can still remember it. Blast processing.
I thought it conveyed the sense of speed a lot better than even some racing games did.
Check that out.
It was probably one of the most perfect 2D characters that's ever been invented.
Sonic was just...
So in comes Sega with Sonic. And he is a character who is a little hedgehog guy, and he's blue, but he has all this attitude. He doesn't stop for nobody. He's just like spinning and going really fast through the levels. This guy is much faster than Mario. Mario's the old man.
Undoubtedly, I think Sonic was a system seller for Sega. As a mascot back then, it was just huge.
And it's just the beginning.
When Sega was riding high on the success of Sonic.
By 1992, Sonic the Hedgehog is a success, selling 2 million units. Gamers and critics alike are impressed with Sonic's revolutionary speed and spin dash. And the inevitable comparisons begin.
Yep.
I was involved with Sonic for a long time, but as soon as Mario appeared, the comparisons began. It became Nintendo versus Sega that the media wanted to compare.
And Sega decided, well, Nintendo has the kid audience. We'll go after the teenage audience. We'll really bring them in with these cool ninja games and these really mature things. That, yeah, there's not nudity or swearing or extreme violence, but they're really edgy.
Sega at that time introduced some really innovative marketing, kind of like the shock tactics marketing that just had never been done in games before. It was amazing. And every player, nobody had two consoles. Everybody had one or the other, and you're either a Sega fan or a Super Nintendo fan. And you either said like, Sonic sucks and Mario rules, or Sonic rules and Mario sucks.
Yeah. Sega really capitalized on that whole, speed feel and said, this guy is much faster than Mario. And it worked. In the US, the Genesis outsold the Super Nintendo, which was amazing, based on the success of games like Sonic.
But Naka simply shrugs it off.
The contents of the game and direction, those were totally different.
They were neck and neck.
So as far as I'm concerned, the comparison was wrong, and I think that was a misunderstanding. I don't want there to be anything bad between us, so while we are in good terms, and if I can work on not keeping a distance, that would be great. We are good friends.
Naka quickly goes to work on a sequel and heads west to collaborate with American development teams.
From 1991 to 1994, I lived in San Francisco.
Naka works with art director Tim Skelly.
I managed the American artists who were trying to keep the styles coordinated.
Yeah, Sega he went to Sega
Technical special stage, and I wanted to do one for this one.
To work with the American
came up with this really interesting code for being able to take a sprite engine and do bitmap graphics with it. So I came up with this ramp, that would go around this half shell, the half circle, and so I did all the artwork for the moving background.
The creator of the half pipe.
The curving ramps and all that.
Sonic 2.
In 1992, Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is released and Sonic gets
Tuesday
a sidekick.
That year, in November.
Once again, Sonic scores with audiences and becomes synonymous with game giant Sega.
The first worldwide release. The first major worldwide
Sonic appears on other systems for Sega, like the Sega CD.
With Sonic, I think there's also the attitude. I think that helps a lot. And being the first, it's easy to copy, but, like Elvis.
It was also really good. It was also selling better in Europe, too.
And I think that has a lot to do with, the success of Sonic. And they've been pretty careful about, protecting, the character.
That is true, Nessie.
By 1994, Naka returns to Japan to work on more games, like Phantasy Star 4, End of the Millennium.
Yep.
And Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is released with a new character, Knuckles. Meanwhile, the Sega CD isn't faring so well.
I think you have to just make things easy for the consumer, and it just wasn't a very easy piece. It was just not, I don't think, holistically thought out. Bottom line is it wasn't easy for the consumer.
And hopes are high in 1995 when Sega introduces the Saturn, its 32-bit console, to compete with the Nintendo 64 and Mario.
Well, Nintendo had, Mario, this short, stubby plumber that, walked around at a brisk pace and jumped on Goombas and, fell on turtle shells. And Sega had the differing opinion. Like in Sonic's just zooming through levels. And as Sonic progressed, that's what he got more into, was just going through at lightning fast speeds. All these amazing looking levels that you didn't ever get to admire. You didn't ever get to take in the beauty of them. Yeah, the speed was impressive.
Even more impressive are other games Naka and Sonic Team create.
Nice. I want to
like
stream
Knights
this at some
in
point.
1996.
Yeah, I know that Knights is a cult favorite amongst a lot of gamers and developers alike.
Sega launches a reported $10 million campaign behind its 3D answer to Mario 64. Although Knights gets great reviews, the buzz doesn't translate into sales.
Yeah. I'd be down for
Knights on the Switch. First time I was kind of aware that games could be art as well as just a piece of entertainment or kind of a toy.
Sonic Team consists of only 100 people. Even if we want to come up with a sequel, there's so many other products we have to create, and I guess Knights is suffering. But then, I'm not thinking, never again. It's not like if I had the chance, I wouldn't make it. The new Knights proposal, we came up with that, and we have been consulting, but we haven't made a final decision or determination.
More Sonic games follow, and in 1998, Sonic Team tries something new with Burning Rangers, an elite search and rescue team equipped to handle life-threatening missions. Despite best efforts by Naka and his team, the Saturn succumbs to the Sony PlayStation.
Well, it's unfashionable to say luck. I don't think it's a lot of luck involved, but I think market timing was really right for Sony at the time, and they put out a superior offering. More people just bought their system.
Sonic Adventure.
But don't count Sonic out just yet, as he shows up in the unlikeliest of places.
Huh? And we get to Sonic Adventure. The game that brought Sonic fully into
Tails, I'm just glad you're okay.
Thanks, but you gotta check out my newest power supply. Ta-da!
By September 1999, Sega reinvigorates its dwindling console business with the introduction of the Dreamcast, and expectations are high.
I think they had a chance. I mean, I used to say, even before I was at the Dreamcast magazine, if you just look at the launch titles that are coming out for Dreamcast, it's worth it to buy it just to get the, the best 10 launch titles.
Like Sonic Adventure, and for the first time, Sonic is in full 3D.
I think Sonic was the perfect character for the 2D world and the way the game was designed. I think Mario probably had a little bit more longevity in the 3D world. We really, I mean, we were in love with Mario before, but when Mario 64 came out, we really fell in love with Mario.
Yeah.
The 3D brought a whole other aspect to him that made his character so much more complex than it was as a 2D character. I think the same can be said about Sonic in when he moved from 2D to 3D.
The Dreamcast was an awesome system. They had awesome games coming out for years.
And Naka certainly delivers. In 2000, he delights his fans with Choo Choo Rocket.
Samba de Amigo.
And the maraca-shaking Samba de Amigo.
Phantasy Star Online.
Phantasy Star Online is released in 2001. It is the first global, massively multiplayer online console
Samba de Amigo's
RPG.
great.
I was working on the Dreamcast hardware and I thought, how can we bring the biggest audience to this game? Of course, online games are then and still now for hardcore players. But the enjoyment of online games needs to be easier for people to access. So we kind of lowered the bar so everyone can enjoy it.
My brother spent so much time playing this on GameCube.
Phantasy Star Online. That was actually my first foray into the whole
I never got the third
multiplayer
one.
universe.
Revolution, we never got that.
Yeah, it's not as big as EverQuest. It was just 4 players.
I still have the GameCube.
It was addicting. It was cracked.
Switch does have Phantasy Star Online too, but it's cloud-based. I hope they make a native version for Switch 2.
The first of those type of games that proved that the market was there for these things to exist, and I think more and more people are going to start exploring the online console realm.
But sadly, it's not enough to revive Sega's failing console business. Although Sonic Adventure 2 is released in 2001, it fails to bring the Dreamcast up to speed with the competition.
Sonic Adventure 2, let's go!
Dreamcast was actually kind of a bit ahead of its time. It was a great machine. I mean, graphically, architecture was really nice to program for. It had a modem in it. But I think the specter of the PlayStation 2 just kind of suppressed the Dreamcast enough that it never really got its legs going underneath it. But on its own merits, if it operated, if it were a vacuum, if
you want to see the Dreamcast episode?
Dreamcast would have been a great product.
That's gonna be next.
The sort of lack of long-term success of the Dreamcast was kind of a disappointment. In some ways, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, publishers sort of thought, well, the Dreamcast isn't going to be here in 2 years, so I better just
we're gonna watch the Dreamcast episode right after
because
this.
Publishers moved on, the Dreamcast wasn't there.
After we're done with the Yuji Naka one.
When the Dreamcast went away, I think Sega admittedly thought they felt behind because they never had any experience working on other systems.
Yep.
But there's formidable talent there and a lot of creative people who I think will only bring the company to newer and bigger heights as a software maker.
And that's exactly what they do. Naka and Sonic Team bring his memorable characters to the new hardware system.
Billy Hatcher.
Hey, you will not believe this new GameCube. Yep. It's so wild.
Over the last 20 years, I've been involved in developing games. During that time, Nintendo has been our rival.
For someone like me,
and I thought one of these days, will the games I create be played on Nintendo?
Seeing Sonic being playable on a Nintendo platform
and then after Sega moved away from hardware, I thought about this all along, just after Dreamcast went away, and soon after Nintendo GameCube was introduced. I began to crave for that.
Because
so we
no one would
focused
have
on
ever
the
expected
GameCube.
it. And to play
like
this
Sonic
game
Adventure 2 Battle for the GameCube
was fucking wild.
That same year, Phantasy Star Online 1 and 2 are released for both the GameCube and Xbox.
Got Billy Hatcher as well. I never got to play it beyond the demo.
Sonic Heroes was released in 2004.
Sonic Heroes. This game was...
I think everyone was a bit shocked at first that Nintendo and Sega had finally joined forces since they were mortal enemies for 10, 15 years.
I mean, it's still a solid game, but nowhere near as good as one and
now they've realized, well, we're better off doing things like Sonic and making games like F-Zero, so...
Yeah, they worked on F-Zero GX.
You know, Sonic's was meant to be for everyone, and you know, I guess it's just apropos that he's on all the platforms now.
Yep. Now, Sonic is pretty much
Miyamoto
everywhere.
in various media interviews has said he likes my work, and I'm very happy to hear that. In the world of games, he is almost a god. So when someone like that praises a game I worked
Sonic
on,
Heroes was
I'm really happy to hear that.
It was Sonic Adventure 2 that they ported to the
In 2002, Yuji Naka is awarded for his contribution to the game industry by his peers. He's given the prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award from the IGDA at the second annual Game Developers Choice Awards.
That's the thing. There was a great game there, but there's so many things that hold it back.
Me the freedom and the resources to make my visions a reality.
And I remember when Naka-san received his award that night, he was literally skipping like back to the hotel. It's rare to see a grown man skip, but I remember one of his assistants telling me, you know, I've never seen him this happy, you know, in his life.
That challenged me to do good work.
And there's also always been an emphasis on innovation. I mean, people don't think of it now, but at the time, games like Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic 2 were incredibly innovative, you know, blast processing.
Samba de Amigo and Phantasy Star Online and Choo Choo, you know, above all Sonic, I think they've made an indelible impression and really contributed culturally to what video games are as an art form.
I'd like to thank the gamers, because after all, that is what this industry is really about.
I think developers recognize how innovative and how forward-thinking Yuji Naka and his team are and how much they've contributed to our industry. He has lots of childlike qualities, which I think translates into his games. Like any great creator, he's always looking about the next place he can bring his art and raise his game. Really brought our industry where it is today, and hopefully bring it into the future too.
Oh yeah, that was true.
I'm now the senior director of the creative department of Sega. I oversee development in many areas. I'd like to change. I'd like to move forward.
Yeah, I can tell that this was from 2004 because this is when Sonic Heroes came out. All right, so we're gonna watch the Dreamcast episode now.
On the heels of a doomed console,
it was a really crucial time for Sega.
The dream was born.
The Sega Dreamcast.
And they really wanted to get back into the race, so they put out the Dreamcast.
It survived an executive shakeup.
So we have parting of the ways.
While this life cycle was cut short
and saved a company.
It did.
Retailers started calling us in week 2 and 3 saying, we're out of stock. We're out of stock. We have to have more hardware. People are banging down our doors.
Like Power Stone, Destiny,
short-lived.
or Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
It just stopped. I mean, it was just silent. Dreamcasts sat on store shelves.
This is the story
Capcom loved Dreamcast so much,
that was ahead of its time.
They ditched their own arcade boards in favor of using Sega's. So that way, the games that they made for the arcades would be easily ported to the Dreamcast. They did it with Marvel 2, they did it with both Capcom vs. SNK games, they did it with Power Stone 1 and 2, and a couple other games as well. I believe a Spawn game as well, they did this for.
In November of 1994, Sega launches its Sega Saturn in Japan.
So much.
At the time of conception, it was going to be basically just a really souped up 2D machine.
A
little bit of hardware.
That's a good game.
And once PlayStation announced their specs and it was going to be this full 3D machine, I think they went in there and kind of retooled it in a hurry, and it probably wasn't as efficient or as powerful as it probably should have been.
Ha ha! So you made it this far, huh?
It actually went quite well in Japan, and Saturn had a long lifespan in Japan.
Thanks to strong arcade ports like Sega's Virtua Fighter series, the Saturn sells 5.8 million units in 3 years.
Honestly,
in Japan,
the Sega Saturn not doing well here actually hurt Virtua Fighter so
beyond
much
anything
outside
we could
Japan.
even compare to in the United States. I mean, nothing compares to how big it is
more
there.
People, way more people in the United
and the
States
idea of bringing that home and being able to play was
fighting games, you think
very
of Tekken.
bold,
You don't really think of Virtua Fighter
on their part.
unless you were a hardcore fan.
In Japan at this point, the arcades were still hot. Arcades have been dead for 10 years here in America, but in Japan, having an arcade hit meant something. So Saturn had an arcade hit.
The Saturn does not catch on outside of Japan and is quickly eclipsed by Sony's PlayStation.
The Saturn launched before PlayStation, I believe in the summer of 1995, which was the wrong time to launch. Also at a very expensive price point. I believe it launched at $399 versus $299.
Yep.
And did not have very good games.
Even Dead or Alive was out of there. Virtua Fighter.
As we all know,
Destiny.
If you want to play a game, you want to have fun.
They were looking to be like this kind of hardcore gamers machine with these ports of the arcade games, where the Sony came in with a completely different approach. They wanted this to be a games machine for everybody, and they kind of really shifted the perception of everybody, of the consumers, towards what a game machine is.
Yeah.
I think for the people who purchased Saturn, they were quite satisfied
Bernie
with the games
Stoller
that they
had
got.
nothing to do with the Sega Saturn releasing early.
There were some wonderful gameplay experiences available on the Saturn that weren't available elsewhere, so it was a purchase that ended up being of value.
That was a Sega Japan move that Sega
If people were purchasing
forced to do.
Saturn because they felt like they could get 10 years worth of gameplay out of it with sufficient gameplay innovation over that period of time,
It pissed
I
a
would
lot
say
of
those people were
retailers off,
probably
but KB
disappointed.
Toys was one of them. Refused to take Sega products.
The Sega Saturn was very successful with the hardcore gamer crowd, and with the broader range
Tom
of crowd, it
Kalinske
wasn't
left in
quite as
96.
popular, but it was still a major name.
Sega was in a really, really tough position.
Yep.
In that they had extended themselves, they had overextended themselves. There was a time prior to Dreamcast, just prior to Dreamcast really, as Saturn was coming out, where Sega had the Saturn. In parts of the world, they were still selling the Master System. They had Pico, they had 32X, they had Genesis, they had Game Gear, they had Nomad. So that's 7 systems concurrently. They had really gotten themselves into a rut. They had completely botched the Saturn launch in North America.
I believe if we look at Saturn, it was a system that shouldn't have been launched. It was too difficult to develop for.
I never played this one. I played the first one.
And the games weren't there. This is not about hardware. This is about software. Software has always driven
Sega
hardware.
has so many games that really need to get re-released.
The hardware will fail.
Like
Saturn's failure causes Sega to lose $267.9 million and lay off 30% of its workforce.
Yep.
There was all of a sudden a couple of years where they didn't have any kind of a console at all. And since Sega was very much a hardware-specific company, that was a very big problem.
Sega's solution is to begin work on a brand new console, and this time, the Japanese gaming giant is determined to learn from its past mistakes.
Well, we really had to reestablish ourselves as a company with all the retailers and gain the consumer confidence back because of the failures that Sega had.
Sega hopes to win back the consumer confidence it had lost and prepares a surprise announcement for E3 in 1998.
Yep.
Then they had a few closed-door meetings. You had to sign your life away on this NDA. You, at pain of death, you could not tell people what you saw for months. By the second or third day of the show, I'd forgotten all about those little NDA things, those non-disclosure agreements that I had signed. I needed to write something for MSNBC about what I had seen at the show, and so I wrote all about this great demonstration I had of Dreamcast behind closed doors. And then I woke up at 6 in the morning and realized what I had done and called MSNBC and said, no, turn it off, please. And they took it off, and of course Sega was furious. They were livid. The happy ending to the story was that my ratings on that particular article were so bad that Sega no longer cared. But granted, it only ran for 3 hours.
Codenamed the Katana. This new system would later be known as the Dreamcast.
I was completely excited at the prospect of a next generation platform from Sega because it was clear that we had struggled with Saturn.
The Sega Saturn was a miserable failure for Sega, and they really wanted to get back into the race.
Yep.
So they put out the Dreamcast way before any of these next generation systems came out.
But would gamers trust Sega after all of their past failures?
Definitely what Sega was trying to incorporate into the Dreamcast, what they learned from the Saturn, was a broader audience. They were trying to make it a gamer machine for everybody. I mean, they were really trying to shift gears there. It was a really crucial time for Sega.
But it was also clear that the company had every intent of rejoining the battle, and we were all ready to rejoin the battle.
Yep.
On November 27, 1998, the Dreamcast is made a reality to the Japanese gaming public.
Yep.
One of the key events for all game consoles is the Japanese launch.
There we go.
The Japanese launches up to this point were something big. I mean, really big. The Japanese government requested companies to not launch their game systems during weekdays because it cut down on national productivity. Trains would be slowed down as they'd go by Akihabara, which is the electric town in Tokyo.
Japanese people loved good graphics. At that time, Dreamcast was very great graphics, so everyone was excited about it.
But the launch is not without its problems. Due to manufacturing glitches, Sega fails to meet shipping goals for the console.
Yeah. So with Dreamcast, they missed their first window of opportunity because NEC was making their graphics chip, and there weren't enough available for a full launch. So a lot of people left stores empty-handed.
The image of the time of the Sega Dreamcast, I think, with the Japanese public looks like maybe Sega's turning over a new leaf. It was a new feeling for Sega, I think, and they really had a successful job of arousing interest in the public and showing that they were maybe ready to start something really strong here.
If they would have went with IBM, I think
it was Sega's next big console after the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was a miserable failure for Sega, and they really wanted to get back into the race. So they put out the Dreamcast way before any of these next generation systems came out.
With the U.S. launch still more than a year away, Sega president Bernie Stolar takes note of the mistakes made by his Japanese partners.
And I was interested in rebuilding Sega, re-establishing the strength that it once had, both in software and hardware, and rebuild a team They became a world-class team to help drive an organization. And that's what I wanted to do, and I believe that the team did that. It's not about one individual, it's about a team.
What I can say about Bernie Stolar is that he did a lot of things really, really right. You compare the Japanese launch of Dreamcast to the US launch of Dreamcast, and Bernie had the publicity in place. He had the enthusiasts really rallied so that they were excited.
While Sega is poised to take the US by storm, Sony is set to shake out the video game world.
At every moment with Dreamcast, it was always kind of threatened by the looming shadow of this unshown thing. The shadow of PlayStation 2 always loomed large over it.
Yeah, that's true.
At the beginning, everyone was very excited and behind the Sega Dreamcast, but as time went on, more and more focus shifted towards the PlayStation 2.
Then, as early as March in 1999, just really a couple of months later, Ken Kutaragi unveiled PlayStation 2. And it was so much more powerful than Dreamcast, and it could do so much more than Dreamcast.
Sony, frankly, was very effective in holding out that promise to gamers.
Nothing was able to compete. Like, it kicked
I think
the
to a certain
Dreamcast
extent, they succeeded in convincing their existing PlayStation 1 audience not to get a Dreamcast and to wait until this mythical new system was going to appear.
Yep.
The Dreamcast excites American gamers, with pre-orders for the console reaching 300,000, shattering the record of 100,000 set by the PlayStation in 1995.
We really had to reestablish ourselves as a company and gain the consumer confidence back.
And they were very, very aggressive, pushing the whole idea of Dreamcast. There was a lot of excitement about the Sega name at that point.
Less than 1 month before the launch of the Dreamcast, the team at Sega is dealt an unexpected blow.
This is what
Right before the day itself, Bernie was fired from Sega.
He was fired.
I didn't agree with who was at that then became my boss, Mr. Okawa. So we had a parting of the ways, and I left the company. It was unfortunate, but the team that I had built and the team that had really helped build the launch, they were in place. They were ready to go. They were ready to drive the product, and they did.
The Dreamcast juggernaut could not be derailed, and the system launched in the US on September 9th, 1999 for $199.
I think what made the Dreamcast so great are really the games. Right from launch, it had a couple really great games. It had Soul Calibur.
Tsurugi.
Sonic Adventure was really popular.
Sonic Adventure.
It had great football games with Sega's
because
NFL
EA
2K
refused
series.
to support the Dreamcast, Sega was like, you know what? Okay, we'll make our own. That was the date that
One of the other things that made the Dreamcast so great is the online feature.
It was the perfect date.
Out of the box, this came with a modem, this system. Immediately, you could be getting on and playing against other people across the country, and that was a real novelty.
Funny enough, the sports games they were putting out were better than what EA
after the US launch,
and here's
Sega
Power
reports
Stone.
selling 372,000 Dreamcasts and bringing in over $132 million.
Better because you can play with 4 players.
The launch was successful. Sega was successful. And it regained the confidence of both the retail community and the consumer.
Virtua Fighter 3.
We knew the Dreamcast was a tremendously successful launch when retailers started calling us in week 2 and 3 saying, we're out of stock. We're out of stock. We have to have more hardware. We have to have hardware. People are banging down our doors.
Sega tried to do all the things that they had done wrong with Saturn right with Dreamcast. Saturn was very miserable to program.
Yeah.
Dreamcast was a snap to program. Saturn had a very old-fashioned controller. It was really just a Genesis controller, still at the kidney bean shape. Dreamcast had a newfangled controller. They really looked and tried to do everything different. And that's how
they took one cue from N64.
But would it be good enough to hold off the PlayStation 2?
So you could do 4 players right out of the box without any adapters. So that's something they took from the N64. Whereas PS2, you still needed a multi-tap.
On October 26th of 2000, the heavily hyped PlayStation 2 is unleashed on the masses.
Even the original
the
Xbox
first year
had
of PlayStation 2, the
like,
biggest hit on
slots.
PlayStation 2 was Matrix. People were watching the movie. They weren't playing the game.
Oh yeah, the Matrix
PlayStation
was
2 sparked the DVD market in Japan.
So
DVD hadn't caught on in Japan.
You watch it on your PS2.
Before PlayStation 2, you'd walk through Akihabara and there'd be game stores every place. After PlayStation 2, you'd walk through Akihabara and you'd see DVD stores.
The PS2 was always going to
exist. If you walked into these DVD stores,
whether or not it would have been
demonstrating
successful is another story.
Movies using PlayStation 2.
Like, tenfold.
The Dreamcast would have been a bigger player, in my opinion, had it had a DVD player installed from the get-go.
Sega looked over its shoulder, and they realized they had lost Japan. There was no resurrecting Japan. They might have been able to hold Japan if they'd had a DVD player in there. Because, you know, in the early days for PlayStation 2, PlayStation 2 was the cheapest DVD player in Japan. And if they had had that distinction, they might have been able to hold on.
PlayStation 2 sales hit $165 million in its first 3 days, and the Dreamcast suffers.
I mean, it was just silent. Dreamcast sat on store shelves. No games did that well again.
Some of the Amigo.
Even good games just kind of sat there and people took them, but it was just somebody turned off the light.
It was a big hit with gamers, but unfortunately it wasn't really, you know, commercially viable. It came at a sort of awkward time and right before the release of the PlayStation 2. So unfortunately it didn't sort of build the fan base that it could have.
Sega, you've got to understand, is hemorrhaging money as a company. They realized that if they could sell 4 to 5 million units worldwide, that they could still have a profitable market. They could last a little longer.
Sega catches a break in December of 2000 when Sony can only ship half as many PS2s as it planned for the holiday season.
Yep.
We had a crew of people who were very into being the
underdog. It was easy to pirate.
You to die like a warrior.
I'm going to be playing this game this year too.
Oddly enough, becoming the underdog almost galvanized us further. Really brought us together as a team because we knew exactly what we had to do.
And they thought, you know, we drop our price, we come out aggressive with all kinds of things, including you could have a free Dreamcast. And it wasn't enough. They pushed. And at the end of Christmas, they hadn't made headway.
What are you saying?
Rumors started coming out that Sega was no longer manufacturing Dreamcast.
No!
And I remember interviewing Charlie Belfield. I said, the rumor is that you're going to discontinue. And he said, no, that's not true. And I said, are you manufacturing them now? And he said, no. And I said, how much inventory do you have? And it turned out that there was more inventory in the channel and in their warehouses than there was sold. And I said, okay, that doesn't look good. Charlie, when will you start manufacturing again? And that was when Charlie said, you know, we have no plan to start manufacturing again.
Yep.
And that was the first time Sega came out and officially announced that, yeah, we've discontinued.
It was a real crush to the egos of everybody. I remember I was in the meeting where we were told that the Dreamcast was not going to continue, and everyone just was silent.
You wonder what was the
speechless,
first
you know, no one
instance
said a thing. It was
where
just
I knew the Dreamcast was
very
dead?
heavy, very
I was passing
oppressive.
by like a local
I don't know that Sega could have done anything
deli
differently
that had
to really
video game
save
magazines.
Dreamcast. The biggest nail in their coffin
And
was Sony
I
really
don't
pushing
know
the
if it was
PlayStation
official
2.
PlayStation magazine or PSM.
To the delight of
And it
gamers
said
around the world,
Sega on PS2,
Sega announces that they are going to create games for all
which
consoles.
blew my mind. I was like, what? And then I read some more game magazines, and I found out that Sega was going to be
I
on.
think it was a time where Sega really had to address
Game Boy Advance
itself
and
and say,
GameCube, as well
are we
as
going to now
Xbox.
just be a software company? And if
And
we are
that
going to be a
Dreamcast
software
was dead.
company,
I was like, what?
is the team that we have here going to be one of the best organizations to build great software? Because that's going to have to be our focus.
Back in 2001, it was wild.
Let's begin.
And that's going to have to be
As
our
someone who loves
drive.
video games, it was hard to
And that's how
fathom
we're going to be able
Sega
to
just
survive.
exiting consoles and only making software. But then when I got my GameCube,
So when Sega
Play
said
Sonic
that they
on
would
there?
no longer be hardware specific, there was a lot of excitement. They really
they
were the
split
belle
what
of the
games
ball.
what games they were going to release and when they were going to release them on.
Microsoft, for their Xbox console, got Sega to promise them Panzer Dragoon.
Yes, Panzer Dragoon Porta.
A beautiful game. But Sony turned around and they had the Virtua Fighter series locked up for themselves.
Exactly.
You know, that was the arcade
Nintendo
hit,
had Sonic
and that was
for a
the
while.
bigger seller.
Before that
Especially
became
in Japan,
multi-plat.
that was a big seller.
Virtua Tennis.
There was a
Virtua
very
Tennis.
committed Sega fan base right up till the end of Dreamcast that very much appreciated the Sega style of gameplay. As we transitioned from a hardware company pushing the Dreamcast platform to a software developer, we were able to successfully convert the Sega fan base to other hardware platforms via our games.
Yep.
We were able to explain to gamers, yeah, you can still have your Jet Grind radio. Oh, yeah. But it's just going to happen on these other platforms. But
I
we
still
promise
gotta
you
play
it'll be
Jet Set
the
Radio
same
Future at some
exact
point.
wonderful gameplay experience.
Like Jet Set Radio is great, but
And
Jet Set
Sega
Radio
gamers
Future
came
still
along
gotta
with
do.
But the Dreamcast will live on in gamers' hearts and memories.
If you picked up a Dreamcast, you were holding something that felt like a gamer's machine. It felt like it was made for games.
Without a doubt, the Dreamcast showed the world that online gaming was possible and fun and interesting on console. So there's no question, with respect to online gameplay, Dreamcast will be remembered forever.
Dreamcast was something special, mostly because, it came from Sega. So the games that really were released
And now
especially
Sega's
at the
planning
beginning
to
were
make a comeback with
some of
Block
the best
Inside
games of the last
Crazy
generation, or
Taxi's
even
gonna
this
come
one.
back.
I've been in this industry a long time.
But
I've
Power
seen a
Stone
lot of
needs to come
hardware
back.
companies come
Someone
and
needs to
go.
tell Capcom that we want
Dreamcast
Power
will
Stone.
always have a position in this industry from a historic standpoint. Because it did so well in the first 2 years that it was there, it really established itself.
Here is a system that was ahead of its time. People who owned a Dreamcast in 2000 and 2001 were probably a lot happier than people who owned a PlayStation 2. Because there were a lot of great games for Dreamcast. I think that it will go down in history as one of the more desirable systems.
Yep. But that's the Sega Dreamcast.
It all started with Easter eggs.
Before we go to the next episode, we do have some sad news. So there was a British video game composer, Jeff Follin, who made music for games like Silver Surfer, Plock, Incredible Crash Dummies, and even Spider-Man and X-Men Arcee's Revenge. Just found out that he recently passed away due to cancer. Screw cancer. Fuck cancer. That sucked. But yeah, I just saw that and I figured I'd just bring that up. Yeah. I heard Plock was actually a really good game, and I would like to stream that at some point. But yeah, screw cancer. Rest in peace to Jeff Follin. Because there's two brothers, Tim Follin and Jeff Follin. They're British composers. They actually did a lot of really good music. There's gonna be a night where I'm just gonna showcase the music they've done. It's not gonna be for Retro Night, but I'm gonna do it in some capacity. I'll figure that out. But he made some great music. So the next episode that we're going to watch, we're going to be watching Pac-Man.
He was born in Japan to less than thrilled parents.
They just didn't have high hopes for Pac-Man. Nobody had high hopes for Pac-Man.
Yet the little yellow dot enchanted a nation.
For the second time in history, the
And Bandai Namco recently just celebrated Pac-Man's 44th birthday.
Pieces.
And the world.
Pac-Man is part of a national phenomenon that had to happen when the TV set married the computer.
His popularity caused worldwide havoc.
There was an American reaction to it, and it was a big
Pac-Man
reaction.
was huge, still
it was
is.
A very angry reaction.
Hear the story of his birth.
Nakamura-san was afraid that Americans would alter the P on Pac-Man, so he changed it to Pac-Man.
Yep.
His defeat.
I had such a tight grip over the joystick at times, I was afraid I was going to shatter it, but I managed to cheat death.
And how he captured our
Yeah, it was originally
hearts.
called Puck-Man before they changed it to Pac-Man.
This is the story of Pac-Man.
we talk about Pac-Man.
Back in the early 80s, every town would have a recreational center.
There's Walter Day again, Twin Galaxies.
There would be pinball games, pool tables, shuffleboard, air hockey, foosball, and then maybe a video game or two. And most people didn't bother to go to the recreation centers in their town until some of the more modern games started coming out.
Yep.
Video games have been out there since about 1972.
Because we watched the arcade one, now we'll just watch everything about Pac-Man.
But all that is about to change with the birth of Pong, a video game that paves the way for the golden age of arcades to officially begin.
What you see here is part of a national phenomenon, a phenomenon that had to happen when the TV set married the computer.
Space Invaders was like the first game in this three-game progression that brought the public completely into the arcades and made them become enamored with video game playing.
Space Invaders had initiated the wave and the excitement in arcades in both Japan and the United States.
And right after Space Invaders, Asteroids came out, and Asteroids suddenly had further enhanced gameplay where people could get very high scores and also got the competition going for people playing against each other in a bigger way than Space Invaders started for high score laurels.
Video games were everywhere.
Boo!
Everybody wanted to go. Everybody wanted to play. Everybody wanted to be the best.
Boo!
It starts with a quarter.
By 1979, the American craze for video games is just beginning.
They seem to have captured America's imagination. And
Billy Mitchell is a fraud.
Well. But on the other side of the world, a young Japanese game designer named Toru Iwatani is inventing something new. Something that will change video games forever.
Iwatani-san is a very interesting fellow. He came to Namco, he wanted to make video games, arcade games, based on pinball. He wanted to make a game that would appeal to women. He wanted to make a game that would be non-violent. And he wanted to make a game using the word tabaru, which was to eat.
To eat, yep.
Namco's president likes the premise. Iwatani is assigned a team of 9 designers to help bring his vision to life.
It was a different concept back then.
Bear in mind, back then, hardware was pretty limited. You could get shapes and colors.
Namco was riding high on the success of Galaxian.
But he started the game, and one of the first things they ran into was, what does this character look like? When I interviewed Iwatani-san, he talked about going to a pizza parlor with his designers.
They were eating a piece of pizza. Somebody pulled a slice out.
And he looked down at the tray and there was Pac-Man staring at him.
Fact or fiction? You make the call.
Yep, the pizza. Yeah, because whenever people take one slice of pizza
After
out,
months
they're just
of
going to see
development and
Pac-Man.
location testing,
Or
Pac-Man is ready for
slices,
market.
see Pac-Man.
But he takes a back seat to a more conventional game.
They made Pac-Man at the same time they made another game called Rally X.
Rally X, yep.
And absolutely everybody at Namco loved Rally X. So then they took the games to a Tokyo Game Show, and everybody at the show loved Rally X. The main thing wasn't that people didn't like Pac-Man, they just didn't have high hopes for Pac-Man. Nobody had high hopes for Pac-Man.
Despite the low hopes, Namco still finds an American distributor.
They hooked up here with Midway Games. Midway was going to import both games. They took both games to an AMA show. Everyone loved Rally X still. Pac-Man was good. Rally X was the game of the show. And then they came out and, well, when's the last time you played Rally X?
Rally X is fun, but Pac-Man was on a better level.
In 1980, Pac-Man is released in Japan and instantly develops a feverish following.
Pac-Man was a hit right off the bat. It was an immediate success in Japan.
I lost count of how many hours I spent on
history,
Pac-Man.
Japanese men
different
had to
Pac-Man
start
games over the years.
Making more 100 yen pieces.
I love Pac-Man.
Because so many 100 yen pieces were sitting in the bellies of Pac-Man machines at that time.
Now it's time to release the game in America. Well, with one major exception.
was originally going to be Puck-Man, based on the shape. And Nakamura-san was afraid that Americans, with their quote-unquote proclivities towards dirty words, would alter the P.
Yeah. If you turn the P into an F, it would be called fuck.
Changed it to Pac-Man.
So, good call on that.
With the new name in place, the Bally Midway Company releases Pac-Man in October 1980 to a hungry American market. Coming up, Pac-Man Mania.
Pac-Man is known as the cute game.
What's the object? You have to clear the...
Yes, you have to get all the dots off.
Yep. The Pac-Man games were one of the few times where my mom would actually play video games. That's how big it was.
Yellow creature gobbles dots while being pursued through maze by monsters.
In October 1980, Pac-Man is released in U.S. arcades, and America catches the fever.
Oh, I played Pac-Man the moment it arrived at a 7-Eleven just outside of Burley, Idaho.
When Pac-Man came out, it caused everybody to fall in love with video games.
Yes. Well, at least Namco did. Some may say they've
arcade game of all time.
They've had the Pac-Man fever.
The biggest arcade game of all time. In the United States, it caught on. You'd go into any large arcade by mid to late 1980, and you'd see an entire row of Pac-Man machines.
And manufacturers have trouble keeping up with the demand.
In suburban Franklin Park, you'll find Midway Manufacturing feverishly turning out 350 Pac-Man games every day in 3 different cabinet styles.
Remember, we're talking about 1980. We're talking about the beginning of MTV. People are still fascinated. They're fascinated with technology. They're fascinated with video, bright images, music, and the future. Pac-Man brought more people in. People went to arcades specifically looking for Pac-Man.
The little yellow guy becomes the media's biggest star.
Believe it or not, Pac-Man games are wildly successful.
Look at this design of that costume.
Pac-Man finds himself in some very strange places.
They popped up everywhere. I mean, 7-Elevens would carry them. Grocery stores
would carry them. This design is not Pac-Man either. He looks like a ghost with legs.
The funny one is that at least one funeral home had a couple of arcade machines in its basement.
They took that from the arcade.
Pac-Man was so good that it managed to escape the arcade and be a unique item for entertainment that could be found any place, not just an arcade.
It was an incredible phenomenon at that time.
Oh, of course it was.
Suddenly, everyone wants a piece of the Pac-Man pie.
Pac-Man was the granddaddy in marketing history.
You should have went with a joke like the pack of the pack. He did.
Pac-Man was the one that made it onto everybody's bed sheets, their pillowcases.
And it's like whenever there's a new Pac-Man game, I'm just gonna say the
Pac-Man is everywhere. There are Pac-Man cartoons. There's a Pac-Man cereal.
Yes, there was a Pac-Man toilet seat.
Pac-Man board games.
Things they wear on their wrists. Things they wear around their neck. Things they wear around their feet.
Pac-Man trash cans. Pac-Man toilet seat.
That's a toilet seat.
Anything you can imagine. Pac-Man is there.
Pac-Man was really the beginning of all that for the video game industry. And it's not unique anymore because everything seems to be doing that now, but they're just following the path that was trailblazed.
Like imagine a Mario toilet seat or a Sonic toilet seat.
Love for Pac-Man knows no boundaries.
This is such a weird design.
And they came into the arcades to play.
Pac-Man does have a nose, but it's not like that. Pac-Man. SpongeBob ain't got nothing on Pac-Man.
But Pac-Man causes mayhem among parents, and he finds himself on the wrong side of the law.
Look at the age group that was being attracted to arcades. It was a new hangout. There was concern about how much time children were playing at the arcades, that they were squandering their lunch monies at arcades. We're talking about in 1981, Americans dropped 20 billion quarters into arcade machines. They spent 75,000 man-years playing arcade games in 1981. That's a lot of time that could have been used doing homework. A lot of time that could have been used in movie theaters, according to Hollywood. A lot of time that should have been used listening to music, according to the record companies. People in all kinds of industries looked at it as a very unhealthy competition.
Pac-Man becomes the poster child for the anti-video game movement.
Pac-Man really was at the forefront because it was the most popular and it was an image that everyone knew. Everyone knew the little yellow ball. Clearly, that was the focal point.
And there was so much press. Everybody who wanted to control and regulate and limit video gameplay, well, then it becomes sort of a renegade thing.
Like, there was like so many people that just spent so much time playing Pac-Man
You make all the older people mad, or you annoy them, or you do what they're telling you shouldn't be doing.
There were big court cases where arcades were limited in the hours they could open and where they could be located.
You're right, Destiny, from Hanna-Barbera.
To it, and it was a big reaction, and it was a very
The most well-known
reaction.
episode from that show was Christmas Come to Pac-Land.
But the protests do little to reduce the fever. In fact, Pac-Mania is just beginning.
Pac-Man
the other one was
had a very
Ghostly
long
Adventures.
lifespan. In 1981, Pac-Man was competing with Donkey Kong.
Yep.
But before it was competing with Centipede, and it was competing with Battlezone. I mean, Pac-Man had just these long, long legs.
And here
Pac-Man was
comes
hot
Miss
right up
Pac-Man.
until Ms. Pac-Man came and eclipsed it.
Ms. Pac-Man is released in January 1982. But the game is created by college students, not Toru Iwatani, the creator of Pac-Man.
Ms. Pac-Man's a great story.
Yep.
Namco had nothing
You
to
could
do with
thank
the creation
Acme for that.
whatsoever.
A team of MIT grad students developed an add-on board, which they attached to an existing Pac-Man board to enhance the game.
Yeah, because I was actually hoping that we would have got
went
Miss
to
Pac-Man as an
Midway,
Echo Fighter for
and they
Pac-Man
said,
in Smash
"We've
Ultimate.
got this Pac-Man add-on,
And that
would you
never
like to buy
happened.
it?" And the president of Midway basically said, "Hey, you know, we've been looking for a sequel to Pac-Man." So they bought that add-on and they added it to Pac-Man.
All they need now is a name.
Oh, Jessica Rabbit.
So originally they were going to call it Mrs. Pac-Man, but somebody said that Mrs. Pac-Man was offensive to women. So then they were going to call it Pac-Woman. But the problem was in the cutscenes, she's a baby. And, you know, heaven forbid we show any Pac-Man promiscuity.
So they went with Miss Pac-Man.
So, a very politically correct Ms. Pac-Man is ready for the arcades. Upon release, she
who is
immediately
this Miss
outperforms
Pac-Man?
her
I only know
predecessor,
Pac-Man.
selling over 115,000 units. But her fame
Objectively,
is short-lived.
Miss Pac-Man is a better game than Pac-Man. Because every stage the map design changes, whereas in Pac-Man the map design is exactly the same.
By mid-1982, the arcade craze fades as fast as it grew.
It did, yeah.
Inevitably, there was a shakeout, and the number of arcades that were existing in America at that time, which numbered maybe about 20,000, which was a lot. It was an arcade in every town, essentially. Then it shook out so that there were only about 12,000 left, and then it shook out more, and there were only about 4,000 left.
Pac-Man was the base game,
Pac-Man
then
family
the
alone
next game
isn't
built
enough
upon that
to
formula.
save
Yep.
the ailing arcade business.
Wow, wow.
Games become unpopular when people get very good with them.
You see, Pac-Man is one of the greatest games, and the reason it's one of the greatest games is because it's also one of the hardest games. Players who become adept at it know that there are patterns.
And so now all of a sudden, instead of people playing for 30 seconds, now you have people who can come in, they'll drop a quarter in, and they'll play for an hour, or they'll play for 2 hours, or they'll play until they're just bored and go home. And that all of a sudden makes the arcade business extremely expensive.
Yep.
By this time, the public's attention has already shifted to another
I know what they're going to
technological
talk about
boom.
now.
In the spring of 1982, home versions of popular arcade
The
games are
Atari
flooding the
2600
market.
version of
I'd
Pac-Man.
like an Atari 2600 system, please, and everything that goes with it. Everything you sure want everything. I want everything.
Pac-Man was the base game, the next game
do
followed
not
that
have to
formula.
be
Yep.
especially good or especially attractive. They need to have decent gameplay, and they need to have the name of the arcade game right on them.
But can home consoles save Pac-Man from extinction? In April 1982, anticipation rises for Atari's version of Pac-Man for the VCS.
Here comes Pac-Man. biggest game in the history of arcades. People are really excited.
Oh boy.
The pre-orders are huge. Atari is so sure that this is going to be a hit that they made more copies of Pac-Man than there were active VCSs in people's homes because people would play it, and this would be a huge hit. But the game stunk. The game really, really stunk. There was just nothing right in it.
Despite the lackluster graphics, the public loves having Pac-Man in their homes. And Ms. Pac-Man follows closely behind.
This Ms. plays only on the Atari 5200 Super System. Now you're talking.
Attempting to cash in, competitors released their own versions of Pac-Man.
Yep.
There were all kinds of knockoffs. So what these companies have to do is these companies have to create something that's very Pac-Man-esque. And so you have all kinds of games that look like Pac-Man.
Meanwhile, Pac-Man's legitimate relatives continue to flood arcades.
Pac-Man is not that great of a game.
There's Junior Pac-Man.
Oh yeah,
Baby Pac-Man.
There's Junior Pac-Man
Super
and Baby
Pac-Man.
Pac-Man, which means
there are all kinds of
Pac-Man had 2 kids.
But all the Pac-Man spin-offs in the world can't save
Junior
the arcade
Pac-Man's
business.
the boy, and Baby Pac-Man's the girl.
By the mid-1980s, the quarters stopped
Mom,
flowing.
can we get Pac-Man? We have Pac-Man at home, Jimmy.
The golden age of video arcades is over. Yet Pac-Man still has his loyal fans. Over the past 20 years, Pac-Man has been released on virtually every system.
Okay, real talk. Who here actually wants to see me play Pac-Man 2, The New Adventure? Oh boy, that game. That fucking game. I remember watching Some Call Me Johnny's review
And the
on
desire
that.
for high scores never wanes. In 1999, Pac-Man finally meets his match. Billy Mitchell becomes the first person to play the perfect
Gaming's
game.
biggest fraud.
People think I'm nuts. You have to be a little
Gaming's
nutty to be
biggest
this
fraud
obsessive
ever.
about something.
On July 3rd, 1999, Mitchell, the president of a Florida hot sauce company, walks into New Hampshire's Fun Spot Arcade and slides a quarter into the Pac-Man machine.
I had such a tight grip
I
of the joystick
fucking
at
hate
times, I was
this guy
afraid I
so
was gonna
much.
shatter it. It was for sure the most difficult thing.
6 hours later,
He
Mitchell
is
manages to
extremely
eat
arrogant.
every dot, every
He
ghost, and clear
thinks he's like the greatest
256
person
screens.
in
He
gaming.
actually
In reality,
beats
he's
the
not.
game.
He's a
6
fucking
hours isn't
cheater.
really
He's
any
a
big
fraud.
deal. I could easily do 12 hours.
Maybe at some point I should do there's an episode of True Life from MTV where they talk about
The
professional
record-breaking
gamers,
feat makes Mitchell
and he was
somewhat
a
of a
part of it.
celebrity.
If I was looking for one to gain fame from, then I picked the right one.
If I'm traveling someplace and if I'm traveling with Billy
He's not a
Mitchell,
good person. He's
it's
a piece of shit.
interesting to see the reaction that the public gives him. He has this unique persona, and people notice that, even when they don't know that he's Billy Mitchell, the world-famous Pac-Man player.
No,
Is he
no,
too old to
no,
be playing
no,
Pac-Man?
no,
Maybe. Am I too old to be doing what I do? Probably.
For the young or the young at heart, Pac-Man is still evolving and still a blast to play.
Billy Mitchell is awful.
There are very few game characters from the early 80s who are still active in today's gaming
Look at all those
scene.
arcade machines, though. He's kind of like a
Pac-Man
heel
would be
professional
probably the
wrestler.
main
He's
one.
like this arrogant
Pac-Man is
bad guy.
engraved in that gaming
Like,
psyche.
in terms of his character, in
Pac-Man
terms of
did leave
like
an
how he actually
indelible
kind of
mark
acts like that.
on 20th century culture, and especially late 20th century culture.
And Pac-Man continues to enchant gamers worldwide with his latest adventure.
For Namco, Pac-Man is still very much alive.
It's a sign that everything has gone full circle.
Remaster
and
Pac-Man
now
World 2,
the original
please.
games are being recognized and given
You
their
made a
due once
remake of
again.
Pac-Man World.
But in a new
Remake
way.
Pac-Man
There'll
World 2,
always be
please.
people who are going to think about Robotron
I want
2084
it.
or Defender or Donkey Kong.
Because everyone says
But
that
the
Pac-Man
biggest
World 2 is the
group
best
will be
one,
thinking
and
about
it really
Pac-Man
is.
when they think about arcades in the early 80s.
All right, next episode we're going to be watching is we're going to be watching fighting games. Hey Ryu, good to see you. He could be one of the best heel managers in wrestling. You know something? He actually could work as a heel manager.
They fed a primal craving.
I just tell you, the moment he walked into the arena, people would instantly move so loud, you could barely hear yourself.
They brought the arcades back to life.
Street Fighter was the biggest catalyst for arcades, biggest source of rebirth.
And they
So now it's all about fighting games.
People always remember the fatalities in Mortal Kombat.
We did arcades, we did Pac-Man, now we're doing fighting games.
Graphic depth. This is the history of fighting games.
Flawless victory.
Mortal Kombat, Tekken, Street Fighter, so many games.
While Galaxian and Space Invaders are kings of the arcade.
It wasn't like a kid phenomenon. It was like really across the board phenomenon in terms of who was playing arcade games.
Yep.
A game designer named Tim Skelly unknowingly gives birth to the one-on-one fighting game.
My second game, Warrior, was, some people said it's the precursor to the two-person fighter, but frankly it's top-down, and the only similarity is your two characters don't shoot their projectiles at each other, they actually make contact with swords.
Gotta start somewhere.
And that really wasn't intentional, and they weren't trying to do anything special there, just to make a game.
When they're facing each other, you can see they're both holding swords and they're facing right.
Man, I remember Tips and Tricks magazine. I used to read that too.
Like the first fighting game. That was like 1979.
It was very basic, but people actually got to compete against one another instead of just like going back and forth like on Punk. You're actually inflicting damage on the other opponent. So I think that kind of started it. People were just like, hey, I like beating you up, virtually.
So the first fighting game was a top-down sword fighting.
Fighting game craze.
But by the time the next notable fighter appears, the arcade market has crashed. And Pac-Man has gone from prince to pauper.
What had happened is we pretty much saturated the market. By the middle of 1982, we were just full.
It was a fad. I think there's no other way to put it. The whole thing just sort of collapsed under its own weight.
But a small handful of survivors continue to make games.
1983, the arcades were kind of going downhill. Data East was a genius at the time because they had this game where you could have two people play at the same time, and everybody knew, what quarter munchers were at the time, but they came up with this idea in this game that actually would double the earnings because you'd always have two people playing on the game at the same time. Karate Champ, it's an arcade game from 1983 by Data East.
This inspired a lot of fighting games that come out later.
Arcade fighting game with dual joysticks on each side.
The NES version sucks.
You did special moves.
The arcade version
had movement from
a solid game for what it was.
The dual joystick.
You basically face off against your opponent, and it was, it was a straightforward karate game, and it was very basic.
Oh boy,
you basically walk up against each other, and you'd start hitting each other. But it was tons of fun because you were facing off against your friends.
In 1984, Konami introduces countless gamers to carpal tunnel syndrome
with
ER Kung Fu.
Fighting games sort of created this term button mashing, where you see people in arcades just madly tapping the buttons and the joystick. And button mashing really led to some people eventually figuring out, hey, maybe we can sort of add some secret combinations of certain buttons and certain joystick moves to, create amazing new moves and amazing new powers that you have in a fighting game.
This is actually not bad.
Kung Fu was really kind of the first game
but
where you
it was basically how it was
first
time. Yeah, that's Jeff Keighley.
And it also kind of established the vantage point of fighting games, which is a side view and two guys standing face to face, and you go at it.
Jeff Keighley is a tool.
And the idea of moves and stuff like that was also developed even further with ER Kung Fu.
Like a young Kung Fu student studying the ways of his enemy, Capcom pays close attention to their competitors' success.
Capcom ended up taking a good look at Karate Champ and taking an even better look at ER Kung Fu and decided that they should combine the two.
To beat Data East and Konami at their own game, Capcom jumps into the fray with the release of Street Fighter in 1987.
The biggest fighting game that really started the genre in a big way was Street Fighter.
Well, Street Fighter had these amazing graphics. At the time, this was 1987, mind you.
And yes, Urban Champion was Fighter, but I'm surprised they were both talking about arcade
games. Except for Ken and Rue, and you're on this quest now. I mean, you're trying to fight all these fighters from all over the world. So now, with that embedded in your head for a second, fighting all these players all the way. You have like a goal in mind.
This game's not good.
I was walking around
when you look at all the Street Fighter games,
people were just
Street
hanging
Fighter
out
1
by this, one game. I was like, Street Fighter, what's Street Fighter? And then these cool characters, dragon punches. Right when I saw rated Fireball, like, whoa, it's cool.
Street Fighter has gamers virtually pummeling each other in arcades across America. But what Capcom does next will hit the arcade scene with the force of a sonic boom.
Oh boy. But without Street Fighter 1, we wouldn't get Street Fighter 2.
The first Street Fighter proves to Capcom that gamers will pay good money to lay the smackdown on their friends. And in 1991, they kick it up a notch with Street Fighter II, The World Warrior.
Street Fighter II was the fighting game that really sort of took the world by storm.
It did.
This was really sort of peak arcade.
Billions and billions of
the early 90s, and everyone was going to arcade basically for two things.
Spent on this game.
Racing games and fighting games.
Other versions
and Street Fighter was the ultimate fighting game.
Street Fighter was the biggest catalyst for arcades and the biggest source of rebirth.
Street Fighter 2 really showed who really was a hardcore player because you could really get your ass handed to you because unless you knew what you were doing.
Exactly, Ryu.
Decisively.
Exactly.
It was so addictive because the moves were so detailed, and it was
so also what made people want to go back to arcade games.
Just throw quarters in that machine all night long and still have fun.
Street Fighter 1 arcade cabinet was a nightmare.
When it's fighting
two giant buttons you have to punch in.
It was pure competition.
They made a 6-button version of it.
Just earn, tens of millions of dollars all over the place. It breeds people to come back to the arcade because they want to get better at the game.
Well, there's really no glory in saying you feature like awesome at Pac-Man. Yeah, I roll Pac-Man.
Street Fighter 2 is what made Capcom a much bigger household name.
It's kind of like a level of respect. You walk in the arcade and see these guys play for hours, and there will be all these court tokens lined up on the machine.
The games that were addictive, that kept you wanting to come back again and again.
They were smart because they made it so that you put in a quarter and play against another person. You lose, back in the line, you wait until it's your turn to go back and play while other people get a chance to play. Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, Samurai Showdown,
fighting genre.
King of Fighters, SNK was at the top of their game.
SNK became certainly the most successful company to follow in their footsteps.
Fatal Fury was a great game. It was the first kind of one-on-one fighting game that we had for the Neo Geo.
They made some other ones like World Heroes.
After Fatal Fury was World Heroes. Later on, Samurai Showdown came out.
Samurai Showdown
was the game that just took over everything. It put SNK on the map.
In Japan,
it kind of gave something different.
The biggest competitor was SNK.
Street Fighter was more like a true 2D fighting game.
But in America,
King Fighter does 2D as well. But Samurai Showdown was cool because you got
in America they had a bigger competitor
special moves
than SNK.
Instead of like the regular Fireball or Guile's, somersault kick, they had like really cool special moves.
Look at this, Samurai Showdown was fun, especially Samurai Showdown 2.
They made an impact on the whole Street Fighter crowd.
And as the competition grows increasingly fierce, designers begin coming up with more wild twists on the fighting genre. Games like Primal Rage pit dinosaurs against one another, while Capcom's Darkstalkers features classic horror movie monsters. But the one game that gains more attention than any other is
Mortal Kombat.
The game that really changed it and kind of took away from Street Fighter was Mortal Kombat. Because in Mortal Kombat it's not cartoon characters, you have the actual person digitized on the screen, and there was blood and gore. You never forget the first time, which is finish him. You never forget that. And
falls right into the pit.
Ed Boon and John Tobias came up with this Mortal Kombat franchise, which I think they would admit is basically, a rip-off of the Street Fighter phenomenon. But what they did was they really took things to the next level, and they, added blood and gore.
Had that
the hidden reptile fight
pulling the guy's head
where
out
reptile
and
had Sub-Zero and Scorpion's
someone's head. Yes, it's over the top. Yes, it's totally exaggerated. I think part of it caused a lot of stir in the news and stuff. Mortal Kombat games showing people taking out hearts and stuff. It's just great. It's just it's entertainment. Fighting fans really wanted something different, and Mortal Kombat gave players that.
Just nobody realized that somebody was going to make that big a step forward in terms of just shocking violence in an arcade game. But it was a landmark.
Liu Kang had the worst fatality brutality in that game.
But the violence that makes
But it
Mortal
made
Kombat
sense for
so
his
popular
character.
also makes it one of the most controversial games of the 90s.
Because he didn't really want
The
to kill
fact that there
people.
was blood in the game was sort of this big controversy.
There was concern about these games.
Controversy that led to ESRB.
About video games being the sort of decline and fall of Western civilization and destroying our youth and leading them down the path of no good.
I hope you walk away with one thought today, that if you don't do something about it, we will.
And the industry felt that we needed to respond in some way, in a proactive way.
They wanted to get some sort of a rating system, but that was like kind of the cause of that whole thing, was the fact that it didn't have a rating system in place.
The controversy over
Ed Boon
games
is
like
still
Mortal
in it around.
Kombat leads to the formation of the IDSA in 1994. Soon after, the ESRB rating system is introduced.
Yep.
Despite the controversy, fighting games hit their peak that same year. Street Fighter the movie is released, followed by the Mortal Kombat movie one year later.
God.
But how much longer will these two fighting giants stay on top? New innovations will bring new challengers.
This is where the
and soon,
3D fighting
just
games
two
come
minutes
in.
won't be enough.
You were Scorpion for Halloween once as a kid? Ooh.
By 1993, 2D fighters are everywhere. While the makers of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat churn out sequel after sequel, Sega's Yu Suzuki works on a new kind of fighter.
The
president of Sega realized that Capcom had a fighting game called Street Fighter 2 that was very popular. He asked me to come up with a game that could be competitive in this field, and I said, I don't know if I'll be successful, but of course I'll give it a try. I decided that I'd like to combine the 3D that I was always interested in with a fighting game.
Oh, wow. The early pioneers in 3D fighting games, you have to speak about Yu Suzuki and the Virtua Fighter series. Just when that came out in the arcades, it was astounding.
I used to love Virtua
People
Fighter.
had been used to fighting in
But
two
like I said
dimensions,
earlier,
moving back
when we were
and
talking
forth
about
and maybe
like
jumping over
Dreamcast and
one
talking about
another,
Sega Saturn,
but
how
not
it flopped
actually
here,
moving in three dimensions.
that
and seeing
because of the fact that Sega Saturn flopped, it actually did affect the popularity of Virtua Fighter here.
Really open up a can of worms.
Where when you think about 3D fighting games, Tekken would be the first one you would think
realm of possibilities for the player.
Dead or Alive would be another
It was
one.
a coup for Sega.
Among many others.
It was brilliant. What was great also was each character had a real technique. I mean, there was Taekwondo, it was Kung Fu, it was, Thai kickbox, whatever it was wrestling, it was like a real thing.
Yeah, everybody had their style.
And it was just very,
It was less about the character, more about their
Just
style.
like with the 2D craze, other companies come out with their own clones.
Virtua Fighter really birthed this whole 3D fighting revolution, which was then followed on by games like Tekken. All those games really took this 3D fighting methodology to a whole new level.
Tekken kind of concentrated on the story of Heihachi and Jin, like the Mishimas, and a lot of stuff going on with those characters. And it seemed like every single Tekken, you wanted to know what was going on with the storyline.
Tekken, it has that whole techniques, the counter stuff, but it's much faster than
Virtua Fighter was a lot
and I
more
think
serious.
people are like
Tekken
jazzed about the
has
Street Fighter
characters
games.
that are like completely wacky and
There's like, is there a 3D fighter out there that's kind of more for our fighting style? And I think Tekken was that game.
And other companies like
Dead or Alive.
they just took the ball and absolutely ran with it. And you can see that in Dead or Alive.
Oh God,
I like
this
Virtua
guy.
Fighter, but if I use different
He
ideas
got
to
you.
describe it, I would say it's an old traditional sushi restaurant. And on the contrary, DOA is like a sushi bar with roller skating girls serving wasabi on the sushi. It's fun.
Oh my God.
As competition between
Itagaki was
fighting
so
games grows
arrogant.
increasingly fierce, developers jump through hoops to draw in gamers.
And then Devil's Third
Then
happened.
you get the people that are really hardcore about fighting games. They're kind of bored with Street Fighter, bored with Mortal Kombat. They wanted something different.
So Capcom introduced Super Street Fighter 2, the new challengers, and that was released in 1993, and that introduced 4 more new characters, Cammy, DJ, Fei Long. They also added a combo meter for the first time. I mean, players had always known, okay, well, I do
and
this
then we
3
got
or 4
Super
combo.
Turbo,
Now you actually would
which had
see it on
supers
the
and also
screen.
Kuma.
And then you have, which I think blew everyone away because it had weapon-based
Soul
combat.
Edge or Soul Blade.
You had Samurai Sword, you had Nunchaku, you had
Which started the Soul Calibur
Calibur,
series.
you had spears. And it was beautiful because they had all these sweeping effects and whooshes and sparks and weapons playing together. And then you have Dead or Alive. I could be fighting someone, they can attack me, I can counter it, and then they can counter my counter, and I can counter their counter. That engine is just genius.
But as the games grow more complex, they begin to have a negative impact on the industry they helped save years earlier.
the more complex the game gets, like Virtua Fighter was, you're definitely gonna lose players.
Yeah.
By moving anything to 3D, there's obviously the risk of making a game too complicated or adding too many buttons. And I think there have been some fighting games that just are just not fun because there's so much to do or the learning curve is so high.
These were games that took a lot of coordination, and it excluded two major classes of people: the casual gamer, the businessman that wanted to play on his lunch hour, and women.
The problem with fighting games was that there was a period of maybe like a year where anyone could get into fighting games, and after that, it was hard for like somebody new to walk in the arcade and not just get their ass kicked.
Killer Instinct, let's go.
Laughed out of the place, so it kind of kept new people from getting into it after a while.
As the arcade market declines again, fighting games will have to find a new place to call
I think that was Def Jam New York. Def Jam 5 in New York. There's Alpha 3.
Towards the late 1990s, the arcade market is down for the count. But at home, it's a different story.
At one point, players were still playing fighting games in the arcade, and they would play at home on lesser versions of the same game. Like Super Nintendo, people would play Street Fighter 2, but they'd still go to the arcade because it looked better, it played better.
But then with a game like Tekken in the arcades was built on a version of PlayStation hardware. So what you have is a game that is very easy to be transitioned to the home console. So what happened was that these guys who were spending quarters night after night into these arcades, spending sometimes hundreds of dollars a month, were able to buy a console like the PlayStation and play it basically for free at home once you bought the game for 40 or 50 bucks.
By the mid to late 90s,
it's not exactly free.
Players
you
could
just
get
bought
something
the game,
that was
but you can play whatever you
almost
want.
as good as or better than the arcades on their home consoles for less money. So why do you go to the arcades to play your games when you don't have to?
So what happened was that people started gravitating towards
Power
playing a
Stone,
lot of these fighting games.
because it was a Dreamcast hardware.
And the home consoles were so powerful then that it was basically, arcades kind of lost their luster.
Not only are home console fighters matching their arcade counterparts, some are even surpassing them.
When the Dreamcast launched in September of 1999, one of its launch titles was Soul Calibur, a game from Namco.
Soul Calibur ran on
one of the
PS1
best
hardware in
fighting
arcades.
games, and it sold
But
extraordinarily
Dreamcast
well
was
right out of
way
the
better.
gate. After the launch of the Xbox, Microsoft was really lucky to have Mr. Itagaki and Team Ninja sign on to do a Dead or Alive 3 game for the Xbox. Every console needs a great fighting game to launch. That's one of the core genres of consoles.
Xbox had the best
Xbox got that great fighting game, Dead or Alive 3, and it really helped the platform.
Which it was.
Dead or Alive 3 did very well on Xbox. They showed the world exactly what the Xbox could do. He expanded on the notion of multi-tiered stages. Not only could you knock somebody off a platform, say, but you could knock them off a huge platform, and they would go through a floor and bounce down.
Take some more damage.
But the old 2D fighters that started it all aren't gone for good. Old rivals team up, and new franchises such as the Guilty Gear series ensure that gamers with the 2D itch have a place to go.
3D fighting games have been a focal selling point now in the fighting game genre. I mean, a lot of players don't want to hear about that. I mean, they still love 2D games. I mean, even me personally, I prefer 2D fighters. I think the best 2D fighter out right now is Guilty Gear X3 Reload.
Capcom had suffered some reversals. Street Fighter 3, for instance,
Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, there you go.
In North America. SNK's later King of Fighters games, 99 and beyond, got kind of a mixed fan reaction.
Oh, yeah.
So they got together and decided to let's settle our differences and give fans what they want. So they created a lot of crossovers. Capcom vs. SNK and Capcom vs. SNK 2, which were straight 2D fighters.
SNK Chaos is kind of
Today, fighting game tournaments such as the Super Battle Opera Championships and the Evo 2K competitions feature both 2D and 3D fighting games. Thousands of players from all around the globe duke it out for cash prizes and pride. Meanwhile, fighting games continue to evolve.
Now, game machines are powerful enough. A big trend with fighting games is that now, it's not just a static environment. You can actually use the environment against your opponent. Even a game like Def Jam, Fight for New York, you can throw
this
your
was in 2004, 2005.
More kind of, I think, is like the success story. They died in the arcades, and then all of a sudden they come up with Deadly Alliance.
Deadly Alliance, and then later Deception.
They kind of went back to the roots. A lot of blood, gore, fatalities, but they just overhauled the engine.
Fighting games are doing really good right now.
It was just phenomenal.
Online is going to become a really important part of fighting games.
Oh,
And
yeah,
I think the
'cause
idea
Xbox
of
had the
facing
Xbox
off against
Live.
your friend in a
Still
fighting
do,
game is
but-
really, really exciting. And that sort of brings
Back
back
then
what
it
it
was
feels
new.
like an arcade to be against each other and punching each other. It's like, hey, I got you there, and having fun that way.
Fighting games have gone from ruling the arcades to dominating home
Super Smash Bros.
consoles.
Melee.
They've pushed gaming to its limits, both
Alpha
technologically
2.
and morally. There's no denying that fighting games helped shape the world of gaming into what it is today.
Now
Every time
fighting
I see
games are
a new
huge.
game, a new Mortal
Still.
Kombat, a new Dead or Alive, Ultimate. I'm just blown away like how much we've evolved. Games are gonna evolve, they're gonna be much better. In the end, the real winners are us, the gamers, who get to play these awesome fighting games.
Have to use the codes.
All right. So that's fighting games. Yeah, there's an Xbox episode. I didn't pick it out though, but there is an Xbox episode. And an Xbox 360 was also an episode that they made. By the time that the 360 was coming out, they decided to make it anyway. I'm like, all right, well, that's fine. But yeah. So in terms of the next episode, Tetris. We're gonna be watching Tetris. Let's go.
It came from the unlikeliest of places.
America kind of looked for us like another planet. We didn't have any bad feeling about it, but it was totally alien, you know?
He came to realize he'd found the gold mine.
Right.
What he didn't realize was that he found the haunted gold mine.
It caused a puzzling international stir.
Here
This is a
I am.
big one
They're
right
saying
here.
I'm a pirate because they never gave those rights out.
It was a game that was developed behind the Iron Curtain. It was unique and new, and we were dealing with Glasnost and Gorbachev.
I'm in Soviet Union. They could just keep me here forever and send me to Siberia, you know. Who the hell knows what was going to happen? I certainly didn't.
While addicting gamers and non-gamers alike.
Tetris got to be the ultimate every person game. I mean, that's a game that your grandmother can pick up and start playing.
It's a big achievement to create something which, you know, is known everywhere in the world. It's like everybody knows what is an Egyptian pyramid and everybody knows what is a Tetris.
This is the story of the most popular puzzle game of all time, Tetris.
And here we go. It's time for Tetris.
During the 1960s and 70s, at the height of the Cold War,
At the time, the United States and the Soviet Union were the two powers in the world. You had two nations with two armies, and the sole existence of their armies were simply to annihilate each other.
Alexei Pajitnov grows up in the city of Moscow.
Didn't look anything like American cities. No advertisement.
Oh boy.
Very, very modest kind of showcase. Everything made out of stone, more or less gray, without any bright colors at all. America kind of looked for us like another planet. We didn't have any bad feeling about it, but it was totally alien, you know. So we just knew very well our life, but didn't care about the life of the rest of the world.
What Pajitnov does care about, however, is his passion for math and puzzles at an early age.
I like all the mathematical puzzles and all the mathematics, and that was my kind of passion in school. And then I get to the special program, to the mathematical class, and I graduate the special mathematical school.
After his university studies in 1979, Pajitnov is hired by the Computer Center of the Moscow Academy of Science.
That's true.
And I was just a regular, researcher there. Wrote some software for artificial intelligence, automatic speech recognition, CAD/CAM system, all kind of stuff.
Yep.
But I still kept my passion and love to all
actually
small
interesting
puzzles
how they did it.
Games which I had since I was a schoolboy. So every time when I had excuse to kind of study new hardware or get new software, I always try to put some kind of game or puzzle on the computer.
Alexei's early work is done on the Electronica 60, a Soviet terminal computer which predated the IBM PC. During his free time, he develops a computerized version of the Pentomino's puzzle game.
Yep.
In his spare time, didn't even get paid for it. Alexei Pezanov, he just made a fun puzzle game while he was working in Russia.
And at one moment, I had the idea to put the pentomino puzzle on the computer. Pentominos is a very, very well-known puzzle, and I love this puzzle.
With the help of a 16-year-old programmer, Pezanov finishes the game and calls it Tetris.
Tetris. Here we go.
really didn't understand where Alexei had gotten the name Tetris, and later really found out that tetra means four in Russian. So all the squares were like a little T or an L, but they all contained 4 blocks.
Yes.
So that was tetra. And when we met Alexei, we said, why Tetris? And he said, well, the only other game he really liked was tennis, so he took the IS off the end of tennis and made it Tetris. And so that's where he came up with Tetris.
Tetris is distributed freely among Pazanov's comrades at the computer center.
Because there was no any software market around, and the only way to distribute software was just to give it for
It is a good thing.
That's what we did.
And the game quickly spreads throughout Moscow.
And we let it go. That was like a fire, like a forest fire. Because in 2 weeks, every computer, every PC in Moscow runs Tetris on it.
This is one of the games that entertains you. If you had, like a busy day and you're back from the office, very tired, it's a game that you can play for 5 minutes, for 30 minutes, or even for 50.
I could spend hours
as long
and hours
as you
playing
want to.
Tetris.
I think why this game became so popular is probably, well, as everything in life, it's a combination of good idea, luck, and maybe good timing.
It really was.
I didn't feel very good about my game because many people playing instead of working. And my bosses in computer center, well, they weren't upset, but they kind of look at me like, like a small kid which do something not very appropriate,
The popularity of Tetris soon catches on beyond the Soviet border.
In 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we start receiving computers, the clone of PC computers from Bulgaria, from the other country, with Tetris on the hard drives. So the game step over the borders.
And captures the attention of a visiting entrepreneur named Robert Stein in 1986.
Robert Stein has his own company called Andromeda Software. He did work with his former colleagues in Hungary, and probably they show him this game, and he was very interested.
Robert Stein has got to be considered one of the unfortunate victims of video games.
He got and put many people in a lot of trouble.
And the simple game of falling blocks soon finds itself in a complex situation.
Very complex.
Immediately after Tetris first catches his eyes, Robert Stein introduces the game to prospective game publishers.
In the case of Tetris, he came to realize he'd found a gold mine. What he didn't realize was that he'd found a haunted gold mine.
Stein flies to Russia to secure the rights to Tetris from Alexei Pezanov.
To a certain degree, in the computer game business, it was still a fairly naive business. A lot of business done in the late 80s in what was still a very immature business, barely over 10 years old, was contracts written on a napkin or a handshake.
In 1986, Spectrum Holobyte's Gilman Louie and Phil Adams see a demo of the game and immediately strike a deal with Stein.
There never really been a product release that had been developed in the Soviet Union, so we wanted to make sure we got the proper rights to the proper people, and we emphasized that to Robert Stein, and he is certainly intimated that he had the ability to give those particular rights.
First of all, Stein pretended that I already agree on everything by replying him.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Stein could have done to save everything. Clearly he was overextending himself. He was promising people that he had all the rights even before he did have them, and that was a problem.
Unaware that the rights were not secured by Stein, Spectrum Holobyte releases the game for the PC in 1988.
It was a novelty. It was unique and new, and we were dealing with Glasnost and Gorbachev and Reagan and that whole time period.
Elorg, the Ministry for Import and Export, eventually takes over Tetris negotiations that same year.
Elorg at that time was kind of typical Soviet organization because they have a contact with foreigners and foreign companies and everything. I'm pretty sure that they had a very strong KGB influence.
But Allorg was this ministry that dealt with exportation. The guys at Allorg were hard hitters. To this day, if you go to the Allorg building in Moscow, there's a big gate in front of it. People warn you that you're getting photographed if you go to that gate. It was a big, shady organization, and the rumor always was that the people at the head of it were KGB. I don't know whether that's true or not, but what I do know is it was very secretive.
And the trouble was just beginning.
It was at one of those early CESs in January in Las Vegas that Gilman and I showed the product for the first time to Hank Rogers. That's kind of how the whole thing started.
I played it and played it and played it until I put the high score on. I couldn't stop playing it. Tetris just kept me coming back. I kept coming back and playing more, and so that's when I got hooked on it.
Fascinated by the game, Rogers approaches Gilman Louis of Spectrum Holobyte for rights to license the game in Japan.
If you license a product from somebody, you rely on them to
indemnify
you and say that they have the rights. So he said they had the rights.
I really
that
think
was good
that
enough
they
for
were.
Me.
Gilman and I then went to Japan because we knew of Hank's
way.
interest. We met with Hank and really kind of consummated a deal for him to do a Japanese version of the product on PC as well as a Nintendo version. Hank also wanted to do it in the United States and was interested in coin-op. And when we kind of called and talked to Microsoft about that, they said, look, we have a deal already in the works with Atari/Tengen.
What Spectrum Holobyte doesn't know is that their sister company, Mirrorsoft, has already sold the rights for a Japanese version of Tetris to Tengen.
I said, who the hell's Tengen? They have no share. They don't even exist in Japan. He says, yes, they traded Tetris for blasteroids. And I said, blasteroid? That sounds like a disease. I said, well, Gilman, you're just going to have to go back and talk to them because we have a deal.
Unsatisfied with only the PC rights, an undeterred Rogers approaches Tengen for the console rights in Japan.
I told my guys in Japan, I said, okay, I'm going to the States. You guys keep on working. I'm not coming back until I have those rights. What I didn't know is the rest of the story. And the rest of the story is that, in fact, they didn't have those rights. They didn't have the rights that they licensed me, or they didn't have the rights that they thought they got from Microsoft.
There's a lot more
Despite
to it
this,
than that.
Tetris launches for the Famicom in December of 1988. Word of mouth slowly spreads in homes and offices everywhere.
End of January, everybody was sold out everywhere. We ended up selling 2 million of that particular product in Japan over about a year.
Driven by the success of Tetris on the Famicom, Rogers tries to obtain handheld rights for the game on Nintendo's new portable system, the Game Boy.
When I looked at all the contracts, none of the contracts included handheld rights. So I went as far upstream as I could go, which was Robert Stein. The problem that he was having is that he had never properly gotten the deals for the rights that he already had, or that he'd given to Mirrorsoft. And so he had to clean that up, and the Russians were running him through the ringer saying, unless we clean this up, we're not giving you any new rights.
When the Tetris rights were negotiated, we were part of a Maxwell Corporation and Mirrorsoft. So Mirrorsoft actually signed the contract with Robert Stein. Kevin Maxwell, who was one of the Maxwell sons, eventually went back over to the Soviet Union to kind of do a more conclusive deal at that point from a rights standpoint.
A scramble for Tetris rights ensues as Hank Rogers, Robert Stein, and Kevin Maxwell of Mirrorsoft coincidentally fly to Moscow at the same time.
I got on the next plane to Moscow. I'm going to track down the Russian agency or the Soviet agency that has the rights to Tetris.
Hank then went to Russia on his own and tracked down Alexei.
That was a total adventure game. I was there and didn't know anything, and I was asking people in the hotel or information or whatever to try to find out this. In Russia or in the Soviet Union, nobody gives you information. It was a very, very strange place.
That's where the confusion came in of what rights had the Soviet Union granted to Stein, who then granted those to us. Maxwell went in and tried to tie up the rights. And I think Hank was playing with something that he knew was bigger.
I was having meetings with the Russians, and then they were having meetings with the Russians. We were all taking turns having meetings. And he says, well, why should we choose you over Kevin Maxwell? I said, well, I'm not somebody from a very rich family, and I don't have a huge amount of money behind me. So I can't make an offer that as big as the offer that he can make you, but I can give you an honest share of the money.
the Russians decide to give handheld rights to Hank Rogers.
Oh, it was absolutely high adventure. It was great. Sitting in a room with a bunch of Russians giving me the third degrees.
However, the controversy continues after the Russians see a copy of Tetris for the Famicom.
I said, this is my game in Japan. They said, well, we never
It's
licensed
really
those rights to
crazy.
anybody.
This whole thing is crazy.
I said, oh my God. Here I am. They're saying I'm a pirate because they never gave those rights out. And I'm in Soviet Union. They could just keep me here forever and send me to Siberia, you know. Who the hell knows what was going to happen? I certainly didn't.
Rogers soon discovers that Mirrorsoft and Tengen do not have the rights for the console version of Tetris.
Well, at the end of the week, they're saying, you know, Mr. Rogers, so would you like to license from us the console rights? And I said, hot potato.
Yep, it's a hot potato.
I knew for a fact that Atari was a huge litigious company. So I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a huge lawsuit. If I now go license the rights behind their back, how they'll interpret it, there's no way I can do this. I cannot fight this fight. So I need an ally.
And the ally he finds is none other than Nintendo.
Yep.
By 1989, console rights to Tetris are up for grabs. With Hank Rogers, Robert Stein, and Kevin Maxwell in Moscow vying for control, Rogers approaches game giant Nintendo for help.
Well, at this time, Hank didn't feel that he could afford the war, but he brought Nintendo for next visit.
A month later, I was in Moscow with Mr. Arakawa and Howard Lincoln, and they were doing a deal.
Angered by what they think is double dealing, Mirrorsoft owner Robert Maxwell steps in and enlists the aid of Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev.
So they were
It
buddies.
just gets crazier.
And so when Gorbachev went to England to visit whatever, he had a meeting scheduled with Robert Maxwell. At this meeting, Maxwell was going to say, my son went to Moscow to get the Tetris rights, and some upstart from Japan got the rights instead. Do something about it. So he was going to apply the pressure, but we were saved by an earthquake in Armenia, and Gorbachev had to cut his trip short. So he never had that meeting with Maxwell. So there was a little bit of divine intervention that happened there.
Nintendo eventually secures the rights and battles Tengen in court.
See, this whole story gets crazy.
They just did. So when it came to Tetris, Tengen was all about challenging Nintendo's hold on it.
They get into it
An earthquake
in
did
court
save
in
them,
San
yes.
Francisco. They're in court not only for that lawsuit, but for patent infringement and copyright infringement. And now they are saying, okay, well, you don't have the right to sell this game.
They had created several 100,000 copies that I don't believe ever got distributed or got distributed for just a few days.
As far as I know, some of the Tengen cartridges did get out to the market, but most of them ended up as landfill.
After the dust settles,
The
Tetris
whole
fever
thing
continues to
just
spread
gets
around the
a
world,
lot
selling
more
about 3 million
wild
copies on the
as
NES
it
in
happens.
1989.
Tetris got to be the ultimate every-person game. That's the game that your grandmother can pick up and start playing. And I think that's what made Tetris really the game that it is today.
In 1989, Tetris is bundled with the Game Boy, putting Tetris in the hands of eager players everywhere.
I convinced Mr. Arakawa that Tetris should be the game packed in with Game Boy.
Because they were going to go with Mario Land.
Everybody can play Tetris, and so they were smart about it and included Tetris.
But then it's
we
like
sold
Tetris
over
ended up becoming the better option.
30 million
to pack the game with
Tetris that way
the Game
on
Boy.
Game Boy.
It just went to a much broader, wider mass media market when it hit the Game Boy.
Pack the Game Boy with
brought it
Tetris.
to a whole new crowd.
Tetris
got a
became a household item.
Looking to capitalize on the heels of Tetris' success, multiple sequels and offshoots spawned.
Yep.
There was Wordtris. There was Hatris. Probably the best Tetris look-alike, my favorite Tetris, was from Capcom. It was Super Puzzle Fighter.
Puzzle Fighter. Dude, this is a good game.
Ripping off Tetris became a
Puyo Puyo.
thing of magic. Tetris became a genre unto itself. Maybe the most significant Tetris ripoff was Dr. Mario.
Tetris sells over 65 million units worldwide. Yet creator Alexei Pajitnov sees little of the early profits.
Yeah,
unfortunately, at the time when they were able to give some bonuses, I was out of computer center. And lots of people in computer center got some kind of goods like refrigerators, kind of microwaves and whatever.
So he didn't get anything, and that bothered me. That really bothered me because, you know, I come from doing business here, and if somebody creates an intellectual property, they should benefit somehow.
As the old Soviet Union collapses, Pajitnov eventually moves to the U.S.
I brought him to the States, got him his green card, and he worked for me. Now he works for Microsoft. He's got his citizenship. The rights reverted back to him in 1996. So this is the big change that happened. In 1996, all rights to Tetris were supposed to revert back to Alexei Pajitnov.
In addition to his Tetris titles, Pajitnov continues to design puzzle games at Microsoft.
Michael Jordan
I don't know if
probably
he's
is a
still a
pretty good
Microsoft
baseball
now.
player.
I don't think he is.
Seriously. But he was so good at basketball that no one will ever notice that. Alexei Pajitnov has done good games since Tetris.
I worked on the very big title, which was very important for my internal.
He actually left in 2005.
That was the title called Pandora's Box.
Pandora's Box was a really wonderful game. No one
The last
will
thing he
ever
made
notice
was
because
Hexagon.
Tetris was so amazing. Tetris was the all-consuming game.
Hexic
Hexic
and Mizaki Blocks are his latest releases for MSN Games, a casual online gaming site.
Hexic is traditional puzzle game when you have hexagon pieces and you kind of rotate them trying to put together some kind of blocks. And the other game is Mizaki Blocks. And the game is very relaxing.
To date, Tetris remains one of the best-selling and most played games. It is on over 60 platforms with no end in sight.
Tetris is in a wonderful position with mobile games because Tetris is perfect for mobile games. It's a very simple game.
Tetris is the #1
Yep,
game
Tetris
on mobile
company.
phones in North America.
All rights
And its
of Tetris
status only
goes to Tetris
continues to
company.
grow.
Sometimes I read science fiction or some novels.
There's so
They
many ways
use
to play
the word
Tetris.
Tetris. It's a normal.
The
Russian
Switch has
word
like
now.
6 or 7
That's
ways to
something
play.
I should be proud of.
It's a big achievement to create something which, you know, is known everywhere in the world. Everybody knows what is the Egyptian pyramid, and everybody knows what is a Tetris.
It's a part of the history. It's definitely part of our industry. I think it will still live and live, and I'm very glad.
As crazy as this episode was, they didn't even tell the whole story. All right.
It all started with Easter eggs.
Next up,
before you know it,
we're gonna be
getting up in
watching
God mode.
Shigeru Miyamoto.
Ready? Ready. 3, 2, 1. Let's rock and roll. Go.
He's behind some of the most famous faces in gaming history.
Well, obviously, he's created a lot of iconic characters.
I grew up on Miyamoto-san's games.
And wouldn't take no
Same
for
here,
an answer.
Silver.
He's not afraid to kind of put his foot out there and say, I'm going to do it this way. If you don't like it, too bad.
Fine then.
He goes all of
He's a
Nintendo.
madman, but he's great. But he is crazy.
For Shigeru Miyamoto, games were his destiny.
Also, Dragon, you gotta remember that Miyamoto actually
Ever since I was a kid, I've always wanted to create things that would
like
shock
he
or
kind of
surprise or
mentored
bring enjoyment to
Satoshi
people.
Tajiri, the creator of Pokemon.
This
for a little
unlikely
bit.
superstar was recognized by Hollywood royalty.
Just by chance, George Lucas happened to be there, and he saw me and he called me into his room.
He gambled.
I find that ironic when you think about that. Because there are people who think that Miyamoto is George
Nintendo that
Lucas
were
of the video
really
game industry.
thinking that the numbers weren't as strong.
And both good and bad.
And won.
He's a pioneer. I mean, everything he does is pushes
Same
the
here.
envelope.
This is the story of one of the most prolific figures of our time, Shigeru
Like him or not,
Miyamoto.
he is definitely prolific. He's not a whole lot. It's not to see. I think they did mention it. It's been a while since I've seen this episode. Yeah. Paper Mario.
Shigeru Miyamoto is born in Kyoto, Japan. with a more than active
Appropriate to use
imagination.
Paper Mario theme for this.
He was quoted as saying, when I was a child, I did nothing but draw cartoons and manufacture puppets.
I had, in elementary school, done a lot of making my own puppets and doing puppet shows. But then as I grew up and got into middle school, that was when I really got interested in drawing comic books.
His yearning to create led to some
He
very
almost became a
unusual
manga
thoughts.
artist.
And I did think that it would be nice if I could
Before going to
be in a
Nintendo.
condition where all I had to do, or all I really could do, was draw comic strips. And so I thought if I could have some kind of illness where I didn't feel any pain or have any trouble, but still had to be in the hospital all day and draw comic books, that would be great.
If he would have decided to become
Nobody
a manga
else
artist,
would that sound like a normal sentence?
oh god,
coming
this
from
guy.
him? It just seems to click.
I remember
By
him
age 11, Miyamoto becomes obsessed with heroic
from the old
characters.
IGN days.
Well, actually, it was on TV where I would see a lot of the puppet shows, and that was where I'd gotten the influence to do that. So that was actually kind of a more earlier thing than getting the TV and getting the interest in the superheroes.
He probably would have.
He goes on to attend Kanazawa College of Industrial Arts and Crafts, taking up the banjo and bluegrass.
Yep. He was in the
But he
country
spends
music.
most of his time sketching
Kind of.
and listening to music. After graduating in 1977, Miyamoto is hired as Nintendo's first industrial designer.
Yep.
Nintendo is better known for manufacturing a variety of goods, from playing cards to toys.
Yep. I love how they have Porygon too.
I mean, even when I first entered the company, it was really my goal to design and ultimately sell these products, really toys that I was interested in.
Miyamoto begins designing board games and packaging for toys. Impressed with his young upstart, Nintendo chairman Hiroshi Yamauchi reassigns Miyamoto to a team working on computer games.
Yep.
By 1980, a wave of arcade games flood the American market. Asteroids, Space Invaders, and of course,
Space
Pac-Man
Invaders was the
develop a
game that got
fanatical
Shigeru Miyamoto
following.
into video
Hoping
games.
to capitalize on the wave, Nintendo releases Radar Scope, their first arcade game. But the games fail to capture an audience. Desperate for a hit, Yamauchi asks Miyamoto to design a video game
Radar Scope
using a
was a
popular
flop.
character who loves to eat spinach.
We began development on that game originally with the idea of using Popeye.
Nintendo negotiates with King Features to use the Popeye comic as a video game, but the Popeye license falls through. And Miyamoto looks to his past for inspiration.
Going into the mountains and playing in the mountains as a kid and finding caves and whatnot, and that sort of exploration too really lingered in my memory. And so later on in life, when I did start making video games, it kind of came back into play in my imagination.
You know, he's a kid at heart. You can kind of see that.
Ever since I was a kid, I've always wanted to create things that would shock or surprise or bring enjoyment to people.
Yep.
He finds exactly that in a goofy gorilla. Of course, the gorilla would need a keeper in the form of a carpenter. Miyamoto goes to the drawing board.
So Mario then became really the perfect game for kind of this jumping around and active expression, and just the motion on screen really became the best game for that type of action.
All he needs now is a name. Kong suggests Gorilla, who is Donkey Stubborn. They combine the words and name the game Donkey Kong.
Yep.
To me, Donkey Kong holds a very precious place for me because that was really the first time where I was recognized for my work in game design.
And unlike its predecessors, Donkey Kong is the first character-based arcade game.
His style is mostly visual. It's always cute. It's always colorful. It's always a little wacky.
These wacky characters need a story to rescue your girlfriend from the King Kong-like gorilla. A dramatic change from the shooting and tennis-style games of the past.
I mean, up to that point, video games had been designed mostly by technical people, and it was really the first time that a designer had actually created a game and been recognized for that work.
In 1981, Donkey Kong is ready for shipment overseas, but not everyone is thrilled with the final product.
These games were sent over, they were in the arcades, and nobody knew quite what to do with them. And it was put into one kind of arcade location. And
I wonder if she's
it
still
did
working
very
with
well.
Nintendo.
More and more people were playing, and quickly we realized in America that we had a hit.
And he's not afraid to kind of put his foot out there and say, I'm going to do it this way. If you don't like it, too bad. And most people need to love it.
And they do. Donkey Kong hits American shores and becomes a smash success for Nintendo. But by
Apparently
1982,
she
the arcade business
retired.
hits a slump.
Not too long
There's a lot of
ago.
product out there. It wasn't selling. Retailers didn't want to, get into video games anymore.
Because I'm just checking
That
LinkedIn
quickly changes,
real quick
however,
to see
with the
whatever
debut
happened.
of the Atari home console. Nintendo is not far behind with their own home console, the NES. Yamauchi turns to his young prodigy to create another game. So Miyamoto gets creative. He takes a B player and makes him the lead.
No,
And then there was this little
not
Nintendo
Perry
Entertainment
Kaplan.
System coming over for Japan, and this character,
Beth
Mario.
Llewellyn.
What was this about?
This time,
I know Perry
it's
Kaplan doesn't
all
work for
about
Nintendo
Mario.
anymore.
Super Mario Brothers is released in 1985 and instantly becomes a hit with audiences.
There was a soft launch in New York at the time, and it did phenomenally well.
Yeah, the 1985
Mario
launch
is
for
very expressive
Nintendo.
in terms of his action, and he jumps and he
NES on
runs, and that's
New York
something
City.
that children do, and they're very expressive in terms of how they move and act.
The unfolding passageways of the game were influenced once again by Miyamoto's childhood.
Yep.
And I remember growing up and reading an interview with him.
Oh,
and
God,
saying how
Cliffy
he rode
B.
his bike to work.
Oh,
and
my
He
God.
drew upon his childhood for inspiration of when he'd roam the countryside and explore caves and everything.
Mario's subterranean world is a reminder of the cool caves he explored as a boy.
That sort of exploration too really lingered in my memory, and so later on in life, when I did start making video games, it kind of came back into play in my
Cliffy B
imagination.
used to work for Epic Games.
Miyamoto includes magic mushrooms, warp zones,
Yep.
and invisible doorways. Mario is an international hit, but he wouldn't be the only character to lead Miyamoto and Nintendo into the record books.
Yep. I was expecting them to show the original ones and not All-Stars.
Super Mario is a smash hit.
Of
And a
course.
revolution in gaming. By creating worlds for players to explore and hidden elements to discover, the game sets the standard for all future home consoles.
Fun. I mean, that's what it all boils down to. He somehow knows how to make a game with really tight controls, very compelling to play, challenging enough that you're going to be playing it for a while.
And it's always a little wacky. You've got trees walking around and flowers smiling. But, it's
wonder
fun.
what
And he makes it all
Casamassino
come
is
together
doing
quite
now.
nicely.
And usually just cute enough and just cool enough to pull in every audience.
By 1987, Super Mario Bros. Sells a staggering 27 million units. Mario becomes one of the most beloved game characters, spawning endless merchandise and even a film.
I know
And
he
even
worked for Apple
Miyamoto
at
is
one
surprised by the success.
I realized that, this wasn't just, how good the game was. There was something more at work there. And sometimes I wonder if it wasn't just, intervention from up above.
And all of a sudden, video games were back on top, and it's all thanks to Mario Brothers. And here was a game that featured a character. It was different. It was its adventure game, something people hadn't seen before.
Oh, he's making novels
And
now.
it went on to be, probably the top-selling video game of all time.
that's,
It was the original Mario Brothers game.
I don't know, actually.
Mario was, of course, the first game to become a really huge hit all around the world and generate lots and lots of fans.
Propelled by Mario's success, Nintendo becomes the most profitable company in Japan and reportedly gathers fans like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas.
There was one instance where I was visiting Skywalker Ranch, and just by chance, George Lucas happened to be there, and he saw me and he called me into his room, and we were able to meet then.
Despite worldwide success, Miyamoto remains humble.
I think really success isn't something that comes just from your own efforts.
I think he recognizes that you can't do it all alone. While he has been
Paper Mario
responsible for
music.
many games, he has a very strong team behind him.
In fact, Miyamoto still makes a manager's salary, a far cry from the millions one would think.
Well, he makes more of that
believe
now.
I am a member of a team.
Star Fox.
Good luck.
The directors and assistants that I've worked with over the years that are now coming to the forefront and
Oh,
working
yeah,
on their own
totally.
games also really value the input and the strengths of working as a team.
For Mr. Miyamoto, he just has wonderful freedom working at Nintendo, the ability to create these games that he wants to create. And
I could have sworn a lot of people started to turn on him
he
before
wants
that.
to be able to have the freedom to do that, and Nintendo has been able to grant him that freedom.
Like, even back in the 90s, there was some people who turned on him because
and remain very loyal to each other. And I think that's a very, very important part.
Stuff that happened in regards to certain games, like I think Body Harvest was one of those games. And also the Yoshi platformer for N64 that got canceled and turned to Croc.
A little bluegrass.
But it wasn't that bad though.
I still play guitar quite a bit.
What happened
the
with
banjo
Sticker
requires a lot
Star?
of technique, so I'll pick it up once in a while and play, but not as much as I used to.
Sticker Star was like a
Dad
tipping
puts
point.
his foot down when it comes to his own kids.
We do limit how much time we let the kids play video games. I think it's more important for them to experience a lot of different things and open themselves up to different experiences. And so I'm putting a lot more emphasis on that now.
With a string of hits, the pressure is on Miyamoto to come up with original characters.
Yeah, I'm surprised that they really didn't talk much about Zelda.
Once you have a success, you want to be able to repeat that and to continue to be innovative. And unfortunately, Mr. Miyamoto has an incredibly creative mind.
And Mr. Miyamoto responds. Miyamoto adds another unforgettable character to his roster.
And for Zelda, really, it
I
was
do like
kind
the
of
fact that they're
idea
showing
of
this one off
exploring
instead of the
a
original.
maze and really getting lost as you're having an adventure, where the
I do
start for
prefer
that game came from. The more that I remembered my experience as a child and exploring the caves, and that I began to pile those experiences on top of it to kind of help with the expression and the expressive qualities of the game.
The Legend of Zelda for the NES also sets records.
Really, that was the first time that something like a Japanese RPG game, a role-playing game, sold very well overseas and became a huge international hit.
September 1996, Nintendo 64 debuts and follows the extraordinary success of the Super NES system released in 1991.
Oh god, they're showing off the
Truly
K64.
a revolution in game development. The console allows players to change their point of view. The result is a game that acts more like an interactive cartoon.
Well, the Nintendo 64 was really, at long last, the system where we could truly create games and worlds in 3 dimensions.
Miyamoto designs the Nintendo 64 flagship title, Super Mario 64.
If you want a
This
more
takes the
in-depth
world's
focused
favorite
stuff in this
plumber
era,
and
you
puts
have
him in an
to
epic
watch
3D
another 2 years.
environment.
You could actually make Mario run, skip, jump, somersault all around, and you could do that for an hour and just have fun with it.
In just 3 months,
You wonder which
Mario
YouTuber
sells
got
more than
inspired by
2
this
million
show to make
copies
their
of
own
his
YouTube
game
show?
in the United States
Gaming
alone.
historian.
With the success of Donkey Kong, Mario, and now Zelda, Miyamoto is responsible for creating 3 powerhouse franchises for Nintendo.
Past music, let's go.
Having Mr. Miyamoto be a part of Nintendo has been critical to Nintendo's success. And it's because of what Mr. Miyamoto has done himself with his games, but also what he has been able to impart on other developers within our company and other developers we work with.
One of those collaborations is revolutionary. Miyamoto teams up with developers Argonaut.
Yeah, Argonaut
Not
software.
only was the first 3D game on a video game console, but also they let us design a 3D chip, which was the world's first graphics accelerator.
Argonaut develops a special FX chip for the Nintendo cartridges, enabling a true 3D experience.
It became known as the Super FX chip, although
That's
during
music
development
from
it
Pokemon
was
Stadium
named the
2.
Mario chip.
The result is Star Fox, a space shooter game. And once again, Miyamoto scores big and consistently raises the bar. He is known worldwide as one of the very best video game designers. Oh yes, Shigeru Miyamoto has graced Nintendo with innovative games and adorable little characters.
Mario Party
But another
time.
endeavor would prove that Miyamoto is along for the whole ride.
How am I still watching these? Well, Enemy, I have plenty of episodes.
By 1998, Miyamoto is heralded as a legend in his own time. His quest for great games continues with the release of a game that mirrors our favorite fairy tales.
Ocarina of Time.
Legend of Zelda, the Ocarina
And
of
also
Time.
G4's not a thing
enlists
anymore.
a team of more
Again.
than 100 programmers, designers, and artists.
He's a pioneer. I mean,
Real talk.
Everything he does is.
I was kind of expecting G4 to
pushes
bring
the envelope.
Icons back.
It's something new. It's something
and
original.
bring on
The pushing pays off when the
Norman
latest Zelda
Caruso
game
of the
becomes
gaming
one of the
historian
fastest-selling
to
games
host
in
it.
Nintendo history.
Obviously
he's
that didn't
created a
happen,
lot of
but I was
iconic
expecting that.
characters. I mean, you can almost
to happen.
equate him to Walt Disney in the world of video games.
Yeah, Ocarina, not Ocarina.
And Miyamoto is honored by his peers as the first recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences.
Yep.
I mean, the lasting impressions that he made are probably the single most influential video game maker in history.
In 2001, the next installment of Nintendo consoles is released, the GameCube. But with intense competition from PlayStation and Xbox, can Nintendo really compete?
I think
they came in third
Nintendo,
place.
Quite frankly, was a little ill-prepared. They had a system in Japan they had to worry about.
It's true that in Japan, when it launched, the initial sales figures were maybe a little bit slower than we had initially expected.
I really think Microsoft came in and kind of like kicked a little butt because they got more systems out there, more software out there, and consequently sold a lot more because of it.
But by the time we got to the end of the year, it had pretty much sold what we expected, and essentially we still had trouble meeting demand.
Miyamoto shrugs off the competition.
Rather than thinking about the competition between the hardware, really for me a more important topic is thinking about the games I've made in the past and what games I'm going to make in the future and how I can find new ways to bring enjoyment and entertainment to the user.
Nintendo's known throughout the video game industry.
Miyamoto has had his hand in over 60 Nintendo titles with new characters.
Pikmin.
Wave Race.
Wave Race 64. Super Metroid. Miyamoto was not involved in that one. Miyamoto was not involved in
breathing
Super
new
Metroid.
life into old favorites.
Oh, Majora's Mask. Mario Tennis. I don't even know how much input Miyamoto had on DK64. Luigi's Mansion.
Hello?
They mentioned it was more Sakamoto and Yokoi. But especially Sakamoto these days. Like, why would they show DK64? He barely had any involvement in that. He had no involvement in the country games. Other than, like,
Nintendo's a company
giving them, like, some sort of design. Yeah, the
But
country was more
Miyamoto
rare.
has no plans of going anywhere.
He definitely and will always, be involved in the game development process. He has broadened his reach a little bit.
I feel like they just put this episode together.
So lately, I've taken on a lot of more managerial style roles within Nintendo, and it's kept me quite busy. But at the same time, I'm definitely interested in continuing to work on games, and I will continue to work on games.
I think in the future it's going to be a lot more of him sort of pushing the boundary.
Well, now he's not really doing that much for games.
So in the very near future, we will be seeing new titles.
Mario Sunshine, that holds some promise.
My idea idea behind Mario is that he's this kind of funny old guy who, for some reason, always appears in the latest, greatest thing at the cutting edge of technology.
Definitely the new Zelda is going to be amazing.
This would have had to been before Wind Waker
We're trying
released.
to create the things that people are expecting. We're trying to create the things that people never expect.
Someone was playing DK64.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nintendo's own Shigeru Miyamoto.
So Shigeru Miyamoto has proved to be a man of ethics and innovation.
Story
but more
water in the background.
importantly, he refuses to grow up.
In many ways, he's one of the true pioneers, not only of great game design, but of infusing entertaining character into his characters, which is something that today
Real talk,
our industry still has.
if Icons would have came back, if they would have made just one episode, it should have been about Iwata.
This is the year that our leading
More
characters
landing, yep.
really go to work in a number of new titles.
I would have also wanted a
So we're
Sakurai
gonna play a little bit
episode.
more with our latest title.
But beyond anybody else, I still think Nintendo will be at the forefront there.
So let's play a little bit.
He's pretty much genius. I mean, he's it, man.
Miyamoto is obviously, you know, most of the console industry stands on his back in terms of history.
Mr. Miyamoto has an incredible mind. He's very creative. It's infectious. Here's this man who has created some of the most endearing video games.
More likely, we're gonna have time for one more episode. So some of the episodes that I had planned are not gonna happen. I'll probably do a part 2 and save some of the episodes for that.
I had absolutely no idea that things
Well, I know
would
what's
get
the
this
next, the
big.
last one we're gonna watch.
I couldn't even imagine it.
All right.
These are network IDs, and if he could look directly into
So
the camera
the one that we're gonna wrap
the person
things
would
off
be
with
able to watch
is
what you
The
play.
Legend of Zelda.
It's a legend of heroes.
Link's a very valiant character, but with a big heart. Tries really hard. He's very kind, very gentle. I mean, in some ways, he kind of reminds me of Miyamoto, actually.
Miyamoto and Zelda,
There's
I've
a
always
missing
felt,
link, yep.
kind of give you that experience of going back to your childhood.
So the ones I'm gonna
It's a
save for
legend
part
of
2
new
are
worlds.
Mortal Kombat, Doom, Metal Gear Solid, and
what was really
History
fun was
V3.
creating
But
all
I'll
these
add
areas
more
to
episodes
explore.
to it. Like I'll add NES, I'll
Going
add
into the
Xbox,
mountains and finding caves and whatnot.
PlayStation 1.
It's a legend of
Final
epic
Fantasy.
struggles.
For the part 2.
Of course, Nintendo didn't really like
Oh,
that
God.
game. Disavowed all
CI.
knowledge of it and doesn't really talk about it.
Great! I'll grab my stuff!
Yeah, Cliffy B's a fucking douche.
Zelda, to me, changed video games pretty much forever.
That's really the most fun and exciting part about developing games is where players
It's like
are
if you
able
ever
to
asked
enter this
Nintendo about
world
CDI, I'd
themselves.
be like, yes, it happened. Let us make no more of it.
It's the Legend of Zelda.
The Legend of Zelda. Also, after this, I'll show off what the next Retro Night's gonna be. Will thou save the girl, or will thou suck?
In 1983, an established Japanese gaming company named Nintendo releases their first home console, called the Famicom. The success of the console paves the way for young game designer Shigeru Miyamoto and his new title, borrowed from a classic American author, F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Well, actually, the name Zelda, we were kind of looking for this name for kind of this eternal beauty or this eternal strong woman, and we actually looked at Fitzgerald's wife, Zelda. She's actually perfect, so we kind of took her name.
In 1986, Zelda is released in Japan on the Famicom Disk System, an add-on feature for the Famicom.
Yeah, I think the original Zelda stood out because it was so epic for its time. It was pretty important.
The story puts you in the role of Link, a a lovable little boy who goes on the adventure of a lifetime while trying to save Zelda, the Princess of Hyrule.
Miyamoto is really interested in taking things that he experienced in his childhood and turning them into video games. Walking through a forest and seeing a little cave. As a kid, you're too scared to go in, but transfer that to a video game and you can go in, you don't have anything to lose, and you can explore and live through the whole excitement of it.
In spite of the failing video game market in the US, Nintendo introduces both the Nintendo Entertainment System, also known as the NES or NES, and another Miyamoto masterpiece, Super Mario Bros. The release of the NES opens the road for Link and his entourage, and in 1987 they debut on the Nintendo Entertainment System in the form of The Legend of Zelda.
Because I had started working on the initial ideas for both Zelda and Super Mario Brothers essentially at the same time, but we decided to quit working on Zelda for a while and complete Super Mario Brothers first. Then we actually decided later on to relook at our work on Zelda and complete that game. With Zelda, what I really tried to do was create a scenario where the player would get into a situation and they wouldn't know what they were supposed to do, and so they would have to use their brain rather than their body, and they would have to think their way through situations. I felt, relieved and almost rescued to a certain extent because Zelda in Japan was the very first game that was released for this Famicom disk system. And so if that game had failed, then the hardware itself probably would have failed as well. So when we released the game and people thought the game was very fun and it became such a success, I felt very relieved and very happy.
But what was really attractive in the first Zelda game was it had an organic overworld.
And what's the story behind this Link guy?
He's a character who starts off very young, and gradually through his experiences he grows and he becomes stronger and he matures.
Link's a very valiant character, but with a big heart.
However, the hardware on the NES has its limitations.
The family computer, or the NES, had very limited capabilities for essentially drawing pictures for the graphics. So one of the biggest challenges with the game was trying to create many different types of enemies with these limited graphical capabilities. And actually, if you look at it, a lot of them you can see kind of inverted images of other enemies in the game. And I actually did a lot of those drawings by hand myself. Really, I think looking back at Zelda and given the limitations of the hardware, I really do think that it was very well done for what was capable at that time.
Yeah, like, you would
This
definitely need
is
a
a type
guide
of
for the
game
original
where you want the player to use their mind. And you start off in an area and you can walk in any direction and you don't really know what it is you're supposed to be doing or what it is you can do.
You could walk around and there's a dungeon entrance, you could go in and fight monsters.
Yeah.
Or you could decide to not go in, go somewhere else first. The game was so non-linear that you could get yourself into a lot of trouble too.
Obviously, we can't just leave the player there not knowing what to do, because if they don't know what to do, then they're not going to play. So trying to find the balance of kind of leading the player into what they need to do and forcing them to think about how they need to solve the problems was very difficult. We spent a lot of time on that.
Yep.
Composer Koji Kondo uses the simple tools available on the NES to create several background tracks, including the now famous Zelda theme.
So that was a big step in video gaming. You could really appreciate the melody because it was so catchy.
Not just the Zelda song, but also the chord that played. When you'd find a secret, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Everybody knows that.
The Legend of Zelda is also one of the first games to allow users to save their adventure.
So you could save your game to cartridge. So for the first time, then you could track the data of your game and the progress.
The Legend of Zelda sells 1 million copies in the US and launches Zelda and Link into video game stardom.
In Japan, a lot of people bought these stationery based on the Zelda franchise, backpacks, t-shirts.
While The Legend of Zelda is still amazing American audiences, Nintendo prepares for their trip back to Hyrule. But some fans aren't too happy with the outcome.
Oh. This is where they talk about Zelda 2.
By 1989, saving a princess has become a national phenomenon. Mr. Miyamoto's position is firmly cemented as the creative force behind Zelda and Nintendo. And while American audiences are still embracing The Legend of Zelda, the curtain rises for the sequel.
Gamers are very particular with their franchises, and if you mess with the franchise too much and evolve it too much, people are upset. And the same thing happened with Zelda 2. When that came out, everybody was expecting a more beautiful or a more advanced version of the first game with more dungeons, more monsters to fight. What they got was a completely different game.
And so really what we tried to do with Zelda 2, while it was definitely a continuation of the story, we tried to make it into a very different game. If you look at Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, that's really more of kind of an action and a more physically oriented game than the original Legend of Zelda was, which was definitely more mental and more problem solving. In that sense, it's definitely a very different game.
The second Zelda, I waited with bated breath.
This game is good, though.
Very good game, very solid.
Stop showing
it was
him on my
almost kind
screen,
of closer
please.
to a Dragon Warrior meets Mario kind of game. It was very strange.
They wanted to do something
different.
different.
I still played it, thoroughly enjoyed it.
They wanted to do something different.
Despite the changes, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, sells over 5 million copies worldwide.
Well, probably more than that, but yeah.
Miyamoto and his team immediately began work on a new installment that will take years to finish.
I think a lot of people were starting to forget about the Zelda franchise. It took a long time from Zelda 2 to Zelda 3. In 1991, boom, there was this new game, and it was spectacular.
Link to the Past.
I mean, it really turned heads, and it sold really well, too.
Back to Nintendo sequels meant
The
doing
third
completely
installment,
different shit.
Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, goes back to its birthplace and makes its appearance on the newest Nintendo system, the Super Nintendo, also known as the SNES.
With the third game, they went back to Zelda 1. After some people complained about Zelda 2 and said, oh yeah, this is cool, but it's so much of a departure from Zelda that it's not really like the first game anymore. Nintendo said, yeah, we had it right with the first one. Let's just give it better graphics, expand the item system, make it bigger, make it cooler looking, and create something that's like the first game, but much more expansive. But what it did have was this beautiful art style. You know, it looked like a
I feel like
picture
this is
book
where
almost.
Zelda really got good.
You had to think three-dimensionally. For example, if you were on the second floor of a certain dungeon, you had to actually push a block into a hole to make it drop down to the first floor. Or, you know, in another dungeon, you had to blow up the ceiling of a room so light could pour into the basement, and something would happen. That was cool. You didn't really have that before.
A Link to the Past flies off the shelves. The popularity of the Zelda series is proven once again. With an historical franchise underway, Nintendo jumps on the technology bandwagon and takes Link along for the ride.
In the early 1990s or maybe the late 80s, the whole CD format became more and more popular. So of course the gaming industry looked at the CD and thought, you know, can we use this? It's, you know, cheap to manufacture these guys compared with carts, which have, you know, complicated innards, and they hold a lot of data. So maybe this is good for video games.
Nintendo asks Philips to build a CD drive that attaches to the Super Nintendo.
But as the months went by, they realized that maybe this CD system, it's a little bit early for it. It doesn't seem to really add anything. So Nintendo tried to wriggle out of that contract as well. So Philips was planning to release a standalone unit called the CDI that was an interactive CD player. One of the deal points was that certain Nintendo games would appear on the CDI.
Hey! Philips creates its own Zelda title, and Link Faces of Evil is released in 1993.
Nintendo didn't want to make it, so Philips contracted a company themselves. Became this abomination of a game, partly because the CDI wasn't set up to be a gaming system. It didn't have a proper controller or anything. It was pretty bad graphics-wise. But they made this game, and man, that was a stinker.
Cool, huh?
That was a So you get this really cheesy and dated cartoon stuff where Link talks to the prince like, hey, yo.
How about a kiss? For luck. You've got to be kidding.
He's all suave and his hair is like this, and it just looks really dumb. And the gameplay itself was terrible. It went back to the Zelda 2 style gameplay.
These
games
games
Nintendo
did not.
didn't really
I'm
like
glad
that game. Disavowed all knowledge of it and doesn't really talk about it.
Help! I'm stuck.
Despite the poor reviews and lack of interest, Philips releases 2 more Zelda games, The Wand of Gamelon.
Great! I can't wait to bomb some Dodongos!
And Zelda's Adventure.
Go now, my princess, and rescue Link.
But then quickly disappears.
What?
And in 1993, Nintendo designer Gunpei Yokoi introduces The Legend of Zelda: Link's
But then we
Awakening
got
to the
this.
Game Boy. Followed up 5 years later with The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX.
Great game. Great game.
So taking what people knew from the home consoles and put them on the portable was a match made in heaven.
I like it just for like a quick hit, you know, then I'll put it back in my purse and it's really good for my downtime.
Finally, you had Zelda on the go, you could play it wherever you went.
2 more original Zelda games eventually appear on the Game Boy. Portable gamers are in Zelda heaven.
It's really tough and time-consuming to create a Zelda game, so Nintendo partnered with Capcom and said, "How about you make the next Zelda game for us?" And they were probably like,
that was actually
you know,
good.
you don't get the chance to work on a big franchise like
The
that. every day."
Oracles.
So they created Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons. Originally, they were supposed to be 3 games actually that were interlinking with passwords, but they had to scale back and they only released 2 games.
Yeah.
Nintendo announces the release of their next system, the Nintendo 64.
Yep.
But will Zelda make the jump?
How do you do an adventure game in 3D? Nintendo couldn't simply go to a store, buy another game, and said, "Oh, they did it right," because nobody did it right.
And there's a surprising twist that will leave fans stunned.
Oh yeah, because in Europe they were called game makers. But it's still Icons. It's just, they called it
By
game makers in
1998,
Europe.
the Zelda franchise has conquered all the Nintendo systems, and Miyamoto and his team of developers are working feverishly on finishing the epic Zelda 64.
Yep.
Aiji Aonuma, a future director of Zelda projects,
he looks
joins
so
Miyamoto's
young.
team.
Aonuma looks so
was
young.
To take essentially the Super NES game, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past,
Like, I know this
and
is like
turn
the
that into
2000s,
a
but
3D
still.
game on the N64, and that was our original idea for The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of
No
Time.
goatee. Like,
So
and that
we
haircut
took,
that he
one of
had.
the items from A Link to the Past, which was an ocarina, and it wasn't featured very much, but we
Ocarina,
decided to
not
essentially take that
ocarina,
and make
please.
that kind of the main item.
I made that
in
same
Ocarina of
mistake and I
Time,
learned better.
and use it as kind of this musical instrument that plays an important role in the game.
But the production lags.
Yeah, because
The earliest showings of Zelda in '95, where you saw this demo of a very short
By the
and
way, I don't really
young-looking
like
Link
Peter
fighting
Schneider.
a knight.
I'm not that great at first.
There were demos in '96, and they said, "Yep, it's coming out soon." There were demos in '97. They said, "Yep, it's coming out soon."
The original Nintendo 64 Zelda was delayed because it was just such an epic, humongous game. And, you know, these take time.
There is so much anticipation for the new game that the Guinness Book of World Records officially recognizes the Ocarina of Time as having more pre-orders than any other game in history. 350,000.
Yep.
When you're actually developing a game, it's really hard to see how it's going to turn out and whether or not it will be successful. But with Ocarina of Time, when we actually finished working on the game and saw what we had created, we were really surprised.
Stop
and
calling it
said, "Wow,
Ocarina.
we really may have done something great here." I think at that point, Mr. Miyamoto really thought that we may have had a big hit in our hands.
The game is finally released in both Japan and the US and immediately sweeps both countries.
Of course, because this was one of the
scope and
highly
depth leave
anticipated games
gamers
of
in
that
shock.
game.
Miyamoto and his team succeeded in bringing all the elements of the original Zelda into the 3D world.
Apart from being the type of game that forces players to think their way through problems, I think probably the next most important part of the Zelda experience is providing players an opportunity to feel like they are a part of the Zelda world. And I really think that with the 3D
It's up there,
environment
but
of
there's
the
better
Ocarina of
Zelda
Time,
games
it was
than
really
this.
able to create the type of scenario and the type of world where players felt just completely immersed in the surroundings within the game.
Like, I
Mr.
think that
Miyamoto isn't one for
Wind
wasting
Waker
time.
Skyward Sword is better.
Well, actually, right after we had completed
Even Breath
The
of the
Legend
Wild
of Ocarina of
had
Time,
tears.
and things had started to just slow down for us, Mr. Miyamoto came to me and he said, "I want you to come up with a Zelda game that we can create within 1 year."
Yep.
So it was kind of based on that idea that we came up with this concept of having a limited time frame that
Majora's
you replay
Mask.
over and over
I
again.
still have to play this
And that essentially became the focus of Majora's Mask.
In 2000, Majora's Mask is the second Zelda game released for the Nintendo 64.
With Ocarina of Time, the events in that game weren't really fixed to a specific time frame. But with Majora's Mask, we actually have this limited time frame that the player would play over and over again. And so the player would essentially have to decide which of the multiple events that were occurring they wanted to essentially become a part of. But depending on how they interacted with them, then the events might change. And so really this became an important part of the gameplay.
Majora's Mask follows Link's fight to save a world from the impending crash of a moon.
Yeah.
The story and gameplay are embraced by fans worldwide. Majora's Mask quickly becomes a bestseller.
Once we released Majora's Mask, I wanted to see how dedicated they were going to be and just how much of all the events that were occurring in the game they wanted to play through and experience. We received a lot of commendations for having created this game system that was unique and new, and that made us really happy.
Knowing that the lifespan of the Nintendo 64 is coming to an end, Miyamoto begins work on a Zelda title that will eventually arrive on Nintendo's next generation console.
When Nintendo announced GameCube at Space World in Japan, they had this really cool footage of Link crossing swords with Ganondorf.
Yep.
And it looked really cool.
I
So
remember
of course
that.
everybody was like, wow. Fast forward to the next Nintendo event, where Nintendo for the very first time was going to show actual gameplay footage. Expectations were high, and suddenly this really odd-looking Link comes up, and everybody's like, what the heck is that?
With Wind Waker, we tried to find the mode of expression that is best suited to a 3D Zelda. And this time we really thought that
I
how we
remember the
portray
backlash
character's movements,
when this game
proportions would
was
become very
announced.
important to the player naturally feeling like they are a part of the world.
Apparently, that was
Taking
one of the
Zelda
main
series
reasons
and
why
giving
people
it a
did not buy a
cartoon.
GameCube. Just that.
But once you play it, you realize that it's the same old Zelda, you'll be hooked, I guarantee you.
With new world
shame,
record
because this
pre-orders
game
of
is
500,000,
fantastic.
The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker is released in spring 2003.
After all these years of working on Zelda, I've been able to fully implement all the ideas that I've been wanting to get into a Zelda game into the Wind Waker. And I'm really happy by that, and I hope that people will really take the chance to look at it and enjoy it and experience it for what it is.
Zelda seized and conquered the video game industry.
Oh,
and
same.
all the fans have to do now is sit and wait for the next one.
Well, I think, yeah, Miyamoto has a certain style. I think he understands what makes a game fun.
I still need to play Twilight
I don't really
Princess.
think
all
of
the way
Zelda as
through.
being a game, but really as being kind of a separate world where players are able to go on this adventure. I really kind of think of the games that I create as being a box. And in a very compact area, I try to provide players with as many tools as they need to entertain themselves. And with this adventure story and the player kind of exploring it on their own, that they will find so much to do to entertain themselves.
Oh, that's the Zelda episode, and that's gonna do it for G4TV's Icons for tonight. I'm more likely going to do a part 2 at some point, because there's a lot more episodes. There's definitely a lot more. I had some episodes that I have ready that unfortunately there's not enough time for it. But yeah, we'll do another one. So next time, before we go to the schedule for the week, I'm going to show off what the next Retro Night is that's going to happen next month. So check it out. A Night of Shmups. That's going to be the next one. We're going to be doing a night dedicated to shmups. I've been wanting to do one for a while, and now I finally get a chance to do it. And that's gonna happen next month on June 27th. So yeah, that's Retro Night. We do have a schedule still. Sunday we're gonna do a double header. We're gonna be doing Paper Mario, The Thousand Year Door, where we're gonna do Chapter 3, and then I'm gonna do Shell Shock Cartoon Network Stories Part 2, which Silver, you'll be a part of that again with Kyle, Epic Man, and Maple. That will continue right where we left off from last time. So, thanks to everybody that tuned in for Retro Night tonight. So, A Night of Shmups is happening next month. Originally, I was going to do Xbox, but I'm like, you know what? I kind of just want to do the Shmup one next. And I'll do Xbox another night. But yeah, let me see who's online right now that I could send the raid over to. Because there's a lot of people on. But that was fun. That was a lot of fun tonight. It was definitely a lot of fun watching all those episodes of Icons. Like, the Mega Man one, like I said, was my first one because I watched it when I got the Mega Man Anniversary Collection. That's actually what led me to watching that. And then when we actually got G4 for a while, like for like a good year and a half, that's where I've actually watched all those episodes, like, or at least most of the episodes. Let's see. I am going to send the raid over to somebody. Let's see. Who is on? All right, let's see. So many people online. I plan to send the raid right now. Like, I will say anyone that's playing Paper Mario 1000 Year Door, I'm not gonna send raids because more likely they'll be ahead of me, and I would like to see the rest of the game myself. But I do got somebody that I've met at the streamers meetup who I'm hoping will still be on. So I'm gonna go send the raid over to Big Rick Energy TV, who is playing Helldivers 2. I'm gonna go send the raid over to them. They're really cool. So I've been wanting to raid them, but now I see them on, so I'm gonna send the raid to them. So we're gonna get the raid call going, and then we're gonna send the raid over to them. So thanks to everybody to tune in to the Retro Night stream. We'll do a Night of Shmups next month, but we got Paper Mario and Sharing with Shell Shock on Sunday. I hope you guys can tune in for that. So as always, make sure to take care of yourselves. Be awesome. Stay awesome. Tell your loved ones you love them. Check up on them as always. For everlasting peace. And I'll see you guys Sunday. And make sure to enjoy your retro games. So y'all have a good night. And be kind. Rewind.